You were saying your people don't have an ah sound.
There's always expressions of that was a lovely cup of tea. But yes, I was watching a dialect expert person on some form of social media reel talking about one of the reasons that
You were reading
uh,
an article, I mean TikTok.
yes, yeah, exactly. I was doing my research. I idly watching videos, doom scrolling, and they were pointing out that a lot of English journalists and people were mispronouncing Kamala Harris's name because the that particular R is not quite an R as in armor, but it's definitely not the flat A that it becomes with Kamala, and that this is part of the reason why Anglophonic people, specifically the British, have a trouble sometimes with wider like Spanish pronunciation and things like that. Yeah, yeah. What we have, and also interestingly, then when we're into those, any of those kinds of things, it gets very sort of philologically existential. If you're not trained to hear that noise, you might not even register that there is a difference.
Yeah.
Which is the fascinating part of where speaking becomes informed by listening and
Yeah.
being able to distinguish, and the limitations of language and things like that, and how being multilingual literally helps us think in more ways and all that kind of good stuff.
I like the parallel in voice that it makes me think of a lot of people consider themselves tone deaf. And if you can hear vowels, you cannot be tone deaf because vowels affect pitch adjustments.
Right.
So kind of like that other meme of you can't say there's only two genders if you can say you're more manly than me, because therefore there's a spectrum. So yeah, but that's fascinating. I love the ear blind, I guess it's deaf, but like whatever it is, vowel deaf, sound deaf thing that happened for me in trying to sing German maybe 15 years ago, of like I just could not hear a different oo from an and
Yeah, yeah.
that happens, I know, with a lot of people learning to produce French, of like you can duplicate the vowel once you hear it, but it's really hard to generate it on your own when you're first starting. Oh, it's very, I am grateful for the simplicity of some Romance languages that have such limited vowel sounds.
Well, yeah, I mean, even with even beyond vowels, like some of the diphthongs and consonant kinds of things. When I worked at a nursery, I was put in charge of a little Polish lad who was learning English in real time and was trying to learn a little bit of Polish from some friends of mine in the music scene, and was really stumbling on I think three different zh noises. I mean, they're not obviously all zh, but to my ear, they all sounded like that one sound. And it was interesting. And the great patience of someone being like, no, like this. And you go, like this? And they go, no, like this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Great patience. I remember there was a time where I was in awe of a friend, Rebecca Boyer, who I remember her being asked the same question about leaf identification or mushroom identification, actually, I think probably 15 times by like three of us. And every single time she had even an increasing amount of enthusiasm for answering you.
Ah,
I
see.
was like, wow, that is masterful. Not only does she love teaching,
Mm,
but she's like, okay, so we're gonna go even more. Like, so here's where we're gonna go and look at the leaf
hmm
nodes here and see where it splits out, or any number of things. And it was inspirational to watch. And I love that idea. The kind of Catholic school model is to shame you, right? Once they've explained it twice. Uh,
mm.
and that's just a common model for teaching, but it certainly, shame doesn't help us. Shame helps us avoid certain behaviors. It's effective as a behavioral management, perhaps, but it's not necessarily effective as a learning tool.
Oh no, no, it shuts down making new connections. And I think that's it, right? The life skill of using those frictions to sharpen your engagement and your passion and fascination, right? Oh, great, I get to talk about this again. And we can go even deeper as we go more fundamental. Yeah, it's a good reflex to kind of cultivate for sure.
And so if anybody ever has a chance to learn from Rebecca at Blood and Spice Bush, like go do it. She's awesome she'll teach you more about plants than you thought you could learn in a day. So
Heck yeah.
on that note of teaching,
hmm
not that I don't think, I don't, I don't really like to think of what we're doing as teaching, because there's no pedagogy here. There's just pretension. I
We're just talking. All we did was talk. All we did was talk.
There's notes and there's references, and there might be a few, Sancto Google in the, or, at least Wikipedia. Uh,
Readings from the Book of Wiki, yeah.
yeah, it's always fun when you go through Wikipedia articles and like, that looks like something. Oh, I did add to this article. That's fun. Uh,
I know because I
I
have
know.
seen it because I have written it.
I am the source of misinformation.
Is that like I want to speak to the manager? I am the manager.
That's right.
What's your source? My dreams.
That's right. But it's also your Gollum and you're both.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, welcome, Preciouses. Thank you for joining us for this very special episode of Radio Free Golgotha. Delighted to be celebrating, commemorating Holy Innocents' Day, sometimes referred to as Childermas.
Episode 42.
40 of the two.
Yes, we are coming on, life, the universe, and everything.
Heck yeah.
So, yes, Happy Childermas, which is just a fantastic word and an even weirder last name. Thank you, Jonathan Strange.
Mm-hmm.
But the Feast of the Holy Innocents, the slaughter of up to 144,000 babes, according to some traditions. So we are proceeding forth in the Sesame Streeting of our lives by talking about this feast and the wee babes that have fallen thereon in I think specifically the Gospel of Matthew. We have as our daemon beautiful entity of being Paimon. I'm not biased at all. And our herb C British pronunciation, which apparently is an overcorrection, which I think we talked about before, but I find that fascinating.
Oh yeah. That the Shakespearean is probably closer to herb.
Yeah. Fennel.
Mm-hmm.
Mineral is lead. The topic for a style of magic, excuse me, is blood sacrifice, which is wonderfully complex and does not just mean of animals. Auto bloodletting and things like this can all be described in that too. The beast, as we have added beasts, is the camel. And by extension, for me, tracing its evolution was fascinating. So I'll slow my roll. Anyway, the calendrical, the Tonopwali calendrical study of the day is Ehekatl, or wind, which is the second day of the 20. The figure is Kata Draconis, and its corresponding Odu, which is Ogunda. The tarot card is the Hermit, and the dead magician, was she ever dead? Oh, but she is always alive and dead at the same time, Erictho. Which is, I'm so happy to just utter her name, even if we are run in terror. But yes, hello everyone, and dear listener, and welcome to Dead Baby Day.
Gotta break some babies apparently to make a mythic origin story for the savior.
Well, tides of blood to allow the savior to arise from it. I mean, like in a tale that ends in human sacrifice, as it is, as a sacrifice, Hebrews chapter 9, that ends the animal sacrifice requirement for the followers of Mr. Christ, who my seventh grade teacher was very adamant to remind us that Christ was not a Christian, or else he would just follow himself around, which was a lovely visual. Nancy Balance, you rocked as a teacher. Okay, so the idea of massive slaughter to usher in the age of the Savior, it almost feels like yes, it's a terrible tragedy, and that's what we're looking at here, that's why it's the Holy Innocents, not just Dead Baby Day. It's Dead Innocent Baby Day, and people by extension will say all babies are innocent, but what if it's the Antichrist? Sorry, I've been watching Evil. Baptize them, that's what you do. So this idea of slaughtering any number of babes in to try and eliminate Jesus from the mortal coil is it also feels like it's also heralding his ascension as a divinity in some weird way if we're going to apply like a blood sacrifice lens to it.
Yeah. That's a really good point. So in this commemoration of bad King Herod getting mad because the Magi don't return with word of baby J,
Yeah.
he enacts this slaughter of the children of Bethlehem, which I didn't find it in Matthew, but is said to be often anyone under any kid under 2 years old. And like
So yeah, Matthew is so chapter 2, 16 to 18. Herod, perceiving that he was deluded by the wise men, was exceedingly angry, and sending killed all the men children that were in Bethlehem and all the borders thereof from 2 years old and under, according to
there it
the
is.
time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. Then was
Right,
fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, a voice in Ramah was heard, lamentation and great mourning, Rachel bewailing her children, and would not be comforted because they are not.
right. And so this happens because he's Herod has managed to rein in, or at least veil his tyranny to the visiting wise men. They meet him on the way and say, "Yes, of course, we're going to pass on these gifts." And he says, "I'm going to give gifts as well, the gift of murder." He doesn't say that. And as on their way back from the nativity scene and giving the famous gold, frankincense, and myrrh, they are visited by an angel in a dream who is not named, at least in the Bibli, but popularly becomes Gabriel as a messenger who tells them not to do that. And so instead they go home, quote, via a different route. And so Herod does not have the whereabouts of the baby that will supersede him. And so, enacting his tyranny, he decides to carpet bomb the whole of Bethlehem's nurseries and homes. So it's a feast day of sorts, traditionally marked by fasting and penance, the muffling of church bells, at least in the British Isles. And there's also some stuff around being nicer to children, funnily enough, of letting kids be kids, of certainly not chastising them, of even like parties or treats for them. There's a bunch of Victorian county folklore, such as that recorded by C.J. Bilston, about how it became a custom for children to be allowed to like actually play in the church. And there's some stuff that I wanted to get into around boy bishops as well, because that seems a big part of the celebrations in England, at least. But is that similar, dissimilar to stuff on the continent and even the New World, Jesse?
Yeah, I mean the Holy Innocents is just an interesting because it seems to be going back to value centers, it fulfills a lot of different anxieties and provides a certain day to reflect on a lot of things. They're not always called innocents, but sometimes just infants. But there is the date itself varies on location, and it's solidified, right, that it can go on the 28th for most of the Roman Church, but it's anywhere within the first 8 days of Christmas. And certainly the British like 12 days standard thing of it being the 28th is what we're going on here. It's a debt day for many things of like if you owe a child something, this is the day you should pay it by type of thing.
Mm,
If the parent could not have gotten them a present on Christmas, if you're from a culture that does Christmas and not Three Kings Day, you would give them one by this point, or you might give a small token to kind of hold them over until Epiphany,
mm,
just as a way of going. I also know that there's many special focuses on miscarriages, both medically induced because of problems with the pregnancy. But this is a day where a lot of people tend to the unbaptized babies that are not allowed to be buried in church grounds. So there
mm,
are some in various Latin American countries where it can be babies are buried usually in the yard of the house so that they're still looked over and oftentimes under the roof, on not an awning but that overing of the roof, so
Mm.
that they're still protected from the elements. And so the unbaptized dead babies actually get associated with the walls themselves of the house and are like living in the walls. So putting out small gifts on windowsills and things like this is common, especially in like the Pyrenean regions in Spain, and it does carry over, it seems, into some traditions of the Southwest in the United States, possibly from same contact with various Spanish groups and the Basques, the Catalonians, and things like this. But yeah, there's a lot to that. I think it's a quick sobering effect of Christmas, and it does seem to be this position is there in order to keep a kind of solemnity of Christmas as well, right? Where Christmas wasn't always a party day. It was the start of a series of feast days, but the real party day is Epiphany. And I think there's something interesting with this of the Holy Innocents is celebrated. Like the timeline is really weird here, right? That
Mm.
finally the wise men get to Jesus on Epiphany, but the 12 days have heavily to do with the wise men, but their journey is over a year
Mm.
as they've noticed the star. And so ostensibly we've talked about this before, that the wise men in my head visit the baby Jesus from last year on this, like as they come now, the wise men coming January 6th, 2025 are visiting the baby Jesus that was born December 25th, 2023.
Ah,
Because it took them a year to get there. And
right.
and we don't, the whole idea of a creche is a Franciscan thing. That was his way of adding in all the figures from the story to kind of promote this Christmas idea. And I love the new literature coming out that is examining, this accusation, and perhaps just a necessary cultural awareness of the relationship between paganism and Christianity, the megalithic paganism that is proposed, the from Paganistan. But the idea that the Christians stole Christmas from the pagans, and you're like, actually, much like Candlemas, it's more that they are noticing how to adapt Christianity to the natural cycles of Europe as it starts to appear in Europe.
Yeah.
It is not so much that they are trying to steal paganism as they are using the same prominent days to fit the mythology. Is that a nefarious thing? Well, it certainly helps when you're trying to replace a religion,
Yeah.
but they were very happy to destroy things when they wanted to. And it's less co-opting and more just like the sun getting reborn kind of is an easy thing to celebrate.
Yeah.
And it's not even so much that Christmas is actually winter solstice. It's more that Jesus died on March 25th, as spring equinox
Mm.
happens and the light returns. And the idea of perfect lives, like a la Shakespeare, of being conceived and dying or born and died on the same day is a sign of a complete life. And so
Mm.
the Annunciation at spring, and therefore the Annunciation and the Visitation of the Blessed Virgin by Gabriel. So therefore 9 months from then is Christmas. And it seems like that is actually their reasoning is basing it off of Easter and therefore the birth coming after the conception, that there's this idea of the Holy Spirit overshadowing and the Holy
Mm.
Spirit and pulling Jesus away, in death.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
said, the Holy Innocents side of it is this little spicy side that, it's interesting. One of the effects of modern memology is that there's a lot of this esoteric lore that we used to feel very special for
Mm.
knowing and being interested in that wasn't as common to talk about. And there's just it I kind of love the humility it brings of like, everybody knows about the Feast of the Innocents now. But
Mm.
what are you gonna do with it? That's the shit that's fun, right?
Mm.
The
Mhm.
magic around it of like forcing an outcome is an interesting side of that, of like praying for an outcome to a situation regardless of the way it happens, just like you need something to end
Mm.
there. um
Yeah, that's a really interesting parallel to how often it is regarded as an unlucky day
yeah,
in the British Isles. It's even called like Cross Day, um, and thereby gets linked to a variety of ill omens, including some traditions of regarding potentially any and even potentially all Fridays as unlucky, being the day of crucifixion.
Mhm.
And that's obviously not universal or universally applied, but we certainly get a bunch of ideas about it being a day of which things begun at that point will not come to fruition. So there's an interesting parallel to like seeking an ending to things rather than seeking a new beginning at this time. You see that anywhere from a variety of people engaged in dangerous professions refusing to go to work that day. The Cornish fishermen are particularly remarked, and that's we've got all sorts of accounts of that from like the 17th century, as it's a day that's ominous to begin a voyage, and not just for mariners going long distances, but even fishermen. You get reports of lead miners for the next 250 years also saying they're not going to the pits that day. There's also traditions around not doing the washing or even any cleaning that day, as it
Mhm.
was sometimes said that it would wash one of the family away. So of this again, this sense of like being aware of infant mortality. Yeah, and into the Victorian period, there's a popular saying about any unfortunate enterprise, which was that it must have begun on cross day.
Uh, do you know much? I only know in passing, and I haven't fact checked, but the things about the boy bishops.
Yeah, I found out a bunch of stuff about that. That's really interesting in terms of speaking about like the tides rather than an individual event of this kind of
Yeah,
season of festivity, and about the kind of notions of an old paganism rearing its head, especially in a carnival mask. So
yeah.
it seems that the tradition of the boy bishops we get from the 12th to the 16th century. There's a little bit of a dip in the 16th century because Henry VIII bans it for a while, but Queen Mary brings it back for a little bit until Elizabeth I puts an
I'm just
end to
gonna
it.
put it out there that I didn't know this was a prompt for you, but I'm really glad that it was.
Yep, softball it to me. Yes.
Teamwork.
So it's a day. The boy bishop is a usually a choir boy who is usually elected by his peers, interestingly, and he reigns in a cathedral. This is connected in terms of the tides of things. They were sometimes elected on St. Nicholas's Day on the 6th of December, and their reign sometimes was from the 6th to the 28th. Sometimes they were elected then, but just got the day on the 28th. And the choir boy would be dressed in the robes of a bishop or an abbot. They would preside over the services. They would do a sermon, and they would often lead a procession, which would go through the town, which would both bless people, and also there were collections of money, both for church upkeep and for a feast and alms for the poor on that day. And interestingly, in some parts of Britain, the boy bishop was actually called and referred to as Saint Nicholas. So they were the instantiation or the emissary, or they were guising or being considered possessed by, we might even say, this particular saint who also has connections to raising dead children.
Or
The
certainly in possession of too, right? Like that's
Yeah,
possession of the saint. Like I just that flow back and forth. Yeah, is it true that if they died, I've never. I'd be curious if anybody has any graves of it, pictures of it, but that if a boy bishop died while they were bishop, they were buried as a bishop.
I don't know. I've not heard that. It wouldn't surprise me, although it would be more likely to happen early on than later, because we do have a speculation that this definitely seems influenced by various feasts of fools and other misrule celebrations.
Yeah.
We have the upending of like the least becoming the most important, the king for a day kind of things, but also how rowdy it was early, right? In many cases, the ceremony wasn't a bringing this boy out and him having to act all stately. A lot of the time, the boys would like rise up and physically throw the bishops out of their chairs and would read like not just proper sermons but also farcical letters. There's reports of them singing a variety of filthy and mocking songs, and it seems to have gone out of favor because these boys got too rowdy. The Council of Basel in 1431 restricts the practice somewhat, and seems to be partly because they're kind of running amok. They're like destroying vestments and parts of the churches and things like that. So I don't know what happens if tragedy misfalls. That would be really interesting. That's definitely a that would be a powerful combination of the bad luck of the day coupled with the inversion of things. That's
Yeah.
fascinating. I don't know. That'd be interesting. We don't get it much later than the 17th century, than the 16th century in like classical, like this is an approved church thing. There's obviously still I say obviously, there's versions of it that are still done in a kind of like nudge, nudge, wink, wink English folklore practice way. But the last popular example, at least in England, is 1558 in at Gloucester Cathedral. And then it kind of dies down a considerable amount. Yeah, it's considered that maybe this isn't. There's ways we can be nice to kids without putting them in charge, especially given what young boys may have a tendency to do when they've been, especially when they've been told that they can't do those things throughout the year, right? No fidgeting in the aisles, etc. And then this day of like catharsis and mayhem.
Yeah, I read something too about it's actually in Lenormand notes that the whip could signify the 12 days of Christmas, specifically because in Tudor era that Tudor children were whipped in the morning and then were in charge for the rest of the day, which also shows that role reversal.
Mm,
But that there were readers that used the whip, meaning the kind of tides of things. And whip is usually something that, it's fast and repeated, so it's a
mm,
repeated action. But it's still very interesting that it could also, as a time period, flag this weird reversal that happens
mm.
on Childrenmas. Those are
That we
very,
should wield our rods and our cattle prods, knowing that they might be turned on us.
yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, that
And there's
does lead to reflections on back to Herod on like the damage of tyranny itself, in various ways, right? Um, of dictatorial governance being about that which we would enact but don't want enacted at us. The externalization of empire and things like that. Um, the horrible euphemism of like collateral damage of who gets in the way of a an autocracy trying to keep power.
yeah. I find the Childrenmas is interesting as it marks the last of the like name days until the new year in the 12 days type of thing. Because you go Christmas, then St. Stephen's, then St. John's, then Childrenmas, and then you have yes, New Year's Eve, but like that's the next thing. You get this ostensibly 2 days of an unnamed thing, kind of like a return to normal after all of this.
Mm.
Rest
In
of
that
it.
period where we eat cheese and don't know what day it is.
Yeah, exactly. And oh, geez. And that you have the New Year's like popping in there, but really it's still waiting for 12th night.
Yeah,
Um, and
yeah. And even in the case of like, yeah, I think about this in terms of like Boxing Day as well, that like it itself is something that's like practiced more sometimes and less some other times, that it's pretty much just a bank holiday now, that any sense, I think in the UK of like being good to our employees has kind of vanished. Like that doesn't seem a particularly consistent thing. But also this idea of like arms at this time of the dark of the year, being at least the story we like to tell ourselves about why we're doing this.
yeah, yeah, that's interesting. I'm trying to think of anything else. I know that this is like an April Fool's Day for Mexico as far as children playing tricks on adults.
Mm,
It's expected. Like it's a whoopee cushion type of day.
hmm.
Because of that, of giving power, which kind of echoes a little bit of the misrule of the children's traditions.
Yeah.
Also, that I always pay attention to when the mass is different, and it's subtle things because it's like talking to the nuns at the abbey. They get very excited when like there's a minor difference in the way they get to do a psalm that night because it's
Mm,
it's 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 different all of a sudden, and
right.
oftentimes the Gloria and the Alleluia are not said on this day because of mourning for the grieving mothers.
Mm,
So they don't, you're not allowed to overly celebrate. You're not even allowed to celebrate Jesus's birth, and incarnation in the same way because you don't say Alleluia.
mm,
You don't do the glory be to God and you don't do the Alleluia when the Gospel's read. So you also get the still kind of a role reversal where the youngest are highlighted in various abbeys and monasteries. So it's even though they're not children, but they're the youngest of age into the brotherhood, sisterhood, the order
mm,
that they retain power as abbess or abbot for the day. I don't think they get those powers in modern parlance, but there is oftentimes like it's a cute little babying of like you're the youngest and we're giving you a crown type of thing, but they don't do it on subsequent years until there's another youngest
mm.
in my observations. Because you get one party, and if you didn't enjoy it, oh well. But yeah,
Yeah, it's a little taste of this is what it's like to be at the top, I guess, as well, right? Or like this is what it's like to have all eyes on you.
yeah. There's some. I know that there are some within some of the workers I have talked to in the Southwest. There's Niño de Atocha, whose feast day is Christmas because it's Jesus, right?
Mm,
But this day, there are some workings that are done with the Niño de Atocha, and they don't, it's not talked about much, but using oftentimes one of the miscarried babies of the family will be enshrined basically as a kind of Niño de Atocha
mm,
in form and kind of heralded as this little Jesus doll, right? And
mm,
you also see some in primping of the Niño de Atocha on this day, which is, it's very common if families keep statues of the Christ child of Atocha in that they change his clothes based on the Christian season that's now. So
mm,
like, at Christmas he's going to be dressed in Christmas robes with, he's going to have holly sprigs and things like that. And that like around his circumcision there's going to be a different color. By Candlemas he's dressed like the Candlemas Virgin and candles are put around him. Like it's Christ through the year.
mm,
And the only weird one is that at Easter, it's yes, they put him in purple, but I'm glad they don't crucify the baby as I'm sure some people probably do somewhere, but that gets a little weird.
mm.
But so yeah, there's attending to Nino de Atocha by some workers, and I'll just mention it in that way of
Yeah.
kind of making sure that the children of the house itself, and the elders of the house are all kind of there's a flow and a relationship that happens that day
Mm.
because of that and because of the children that have died so that Christ might live and therefore again all babies who ever die are viewed as joining the holy innocents in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, not just a day of remembrance, but something that inculcates a sense of commemoration for everyone. Mm,
Yeah, that the and there's a thing where I know there's some folk magic in Latin America that is specifically if you're using call for things, this is a very strong day to use it because it's considered the mourner's call. Um,
right.
so
Yeah.
call of a living baby has its uses, the call of a dead baby has different uses.
Mm.
And so yeah, lots of inspiration and some pretty uh solemn uh magics on that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Gruel is the other one that I have notes here.
Oh
One
yeah.
that you serve baby foods.
Okay. Okay.
You serve porridges, and this is not a day for like meat on the bone. Everything has to be soft, uh,
Mm.
and that type of thing. But you know,
That's it. That's interesting in terms of talking about both children and mortality in terms of stuff that I ended up looking up for the Hermit when we get to it about the As You Like It stuff, the Shakespearean thing about talking about senility as a second childishness, sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. Yeah, that we return to a baby-like status in the privilege of getting old.
yeah, the
Mm,
porridges are usually like, rice pudding or oatmeal or something like that, and they always have a vibrant red sauce on them.
mm,
So like raspberries or cherries or things like that. So it's a little bloody baby food. Oftentimes the
mm,
child can choose the menu too, from what I understand.
mm,
I've never felt, that in particular, but there is a Catholic blessing for fathers to give each of their children using holy water on this day too. That specifically in thy grace and goodness, let them advance continually, longing for thee, loving thee, fearing thee, keeping thy commandments. Then they will surely come to their destined home through thee, Savior of the world, who lives and reigns forever and ever. And you do a sign of the cross on the forehead with them.
mm,
May God bless you. May he keep your hearts and minds, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Um,
mm,
but this is specifically for parents to give to their bebés
mm.
uh, on that day.
You
Uh,
do see a lot of linking in a bunch of the folk and bewitching practices I've been looking at around those for children specifically are often linked to the rising sun as well. I mean, obviously, like dawn is a great time to do most things, but this sense of like the reborn sun being around this time and the promise of not just today but tomorrow for the little ones that we care most about. Yeah, that's really
yeah,
interesting.
New Annie soundtrack. Yes, absolutely.
Hmm.
There's also for those that are the midwives of the other midwives had to do these procedures both ways, right? Of birthing babies or terminating pregnancies
Yeah.
that were not viable or just unwanted or problematic or any number of things. So there is a tradition in that trade of blessing certain tools and certain herbal things that hold the herbal remedies for such to bless them on this day
Mm.
so that your work is approved by God. So, and that actually is done at sunset traditionally, so it makes sense there.
Huh. Yeah,
Baby,
yeah,
babies alive in the morning, babies that need to go away in the evening,
yeah.
and then you pray for them. I know that there's a vigil in many partera households of like if that has to happen, that you sit vigil and you wait for the rising sun so that the spirit can remember that it does get to come again. That it can come again at a later time. Any number of folk beliefs that do not make sense within a catechistic Catholic context, but
Oh,
make
but the kind of Angelitos stuff, right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. That soul gets to go back to heaven's waiting room for a time when they can come through
yeah. It's
successfully. Yeah.
there's a mythic tree in Mesoamerican mythology, in the land of Tamawanchan, I think, the land of mists, where there is a tree that is suckling infants, with breasts. The tree has fruit that is human breasts that dead babies go to, and they are nourished by this tree.
That's lovely. Hmm.
So yeah, holy innocents. What's the segue there? Interesting. Blood sacrifice. But I feel like demon is what we do next anyway. So blood sacrifice and back to demon.
Hmm. And
Uh,
back to demon. All right. From the careful shepherding of children to a recent popular movie's depiction of demonic family pacts of harvesting children for the bodies of a demon king queen question mark. That's right. It's a
Crown.
hereditary reference. Bam. I am your mother. It's Paimon. Paimon, Pomon, Poimon, etc. One
Oh,
of the
I don't
the
like that.
four principal spirits. Yeah.
That was a nice pause.
Yep, that's the respectful pause, right?
Everyone's gonna be heady at that point.
So we
Uh,
are not without a glut of evidence. Paimon is not just regarded as one of the four spirits who are rulers of the four regions and quarters of the world. They turn up in an awful lot of demonological texts. We have indeed one of the quote long texts from the Goetia of Solomon about them and various other spirits. We've got plenty to get into in terms of how they are framed as both their officers, spirits that serve them or are related to them as heralds or sub-kings, some notes about their fallen angelology, um, as well as reflections on where they have some grimoiric doubles, or what Jake liked to call grimoiric ghosts, of a couple of the spirits that seem to be adopting their heraldry and seem connected to them that way. Yeah, so we can start from sources we've got earlier sources being Livre d'Esprits. They turn up a lot in the various books of the offices of the spirits. They then find their way into Scott's spirit catalogue. There's some interesting embroidering, shall we say, of the of them in the German Honorius text a little later. And then we have all sorts of notes about proper conduct of the exorcist from the long texts as well. So happy to get stuck into any of that. Is there anything you want to say at the top of that, though?
no, I mean, sure. Paimon, I like Paimon. Uh,
Hmm.
I remember watching Hereditary and being very confused why they changed the sigils so obviously in the first scene, in the
Mm.
see it for the first time, and then realizing, oh, that was probably smart. Um,
Yeah, I've had some great conversations with people about like the broad category that Charles and I like to call charm reduction, of
Uh-huh.
like how do we tell a story, how do we do a good fiction without horror movies are beset by we wanted to do a supernatural horror and then all sorts of supernatural things started messing with our equipment and so on. To what extent are we is your attempt as a filmmaker to actually radicalize people? But this is a fundamentally perennial issue with the wider thing we call demonology, not just the study of demons, but the warning of people about demons, right? This is something that Veya's very concerned with. This is something that Scott should probably be more concerned with, but then we wouldn't have it. The idea of like, how do you tell people about an evil and show them what it might look like without giving them the full means to do it?
You don't.
Exactly. Apparently, one of the ways is to change the sigil, right?
Yeah,
Um,
because I remember thinking it was like, man, I don't remember Payman's sigil having three people looking like they're on horseback.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
or a little canoe or something. Yeah.
yeah, because it would have made much more sense to me to connect them to said magi earlier or any number of trinities. I was like,
Hmm.
I'm pretty sure it has four. But anyway, yes, it has four, except in the movie. And in the movie world, that is not Payman's sigil. So yeah, I think the interesting side with Payman too is that for the thing that and please go into everything as much as you feel detailed to go into. The side I remember having it's the effeminate demon king, right? Like so that there's either a feminine face
Yeah.
or post Jake specifically showing that there were manuscripts where Payman was absolutely called a she.
Yeah.
And that this goes back and forth. And so is it the misogyny of kings must be male? Is it do angels and demons actually have sex and or gender? Well, do they have sex? The answer is yes, always. Hopefully, anyway, invoking Pascal Beverly Randolph, but towards the demonic. That and also in line with our blood sacrifice thing, that this is one of the times that blood sacrifice is actually discussed, or at least sacrifice.
Yeah.
It's assumed to be blood sacrifice to that if Payment appears alone, and again, here's a trinity, but not to reflect in the sigil that is in Hereditary, but Labal and Abalam of who serve Payment and do not always accompany that you must give sacrifice to summon them.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. And this goes way back, right? So our first like formal grimoiric stuff is the Liber de Spritz, which is 15th, 16th century. But you've got Cecco d'Ascoli in the 13th century, talking about, yes, these four spirits of great virtue stand in cruciatis locis, but also specifically points out because of their noble nature, they seek sacrifice from human blood and from the flesh, likewise, of a dead man or a cat, interestingly. But this Zoroastrian art cannot be carried on without great peril, fastings, prayers, and all things which are contrary to our faith. That's the quote from Cecco that Thorndike includes in their essay on some medieval conceptions. So yeah, you do have this root notion that Paimon appears as a crowned woman, highly resplendent and mounted upon a camel. Then immediately it switches to whoever compels him in the Libre des Spritz, right? Must face towards the West, this absolute association with the West, and various other things about it. So this idea that they're not just effeminate, but appeareth as a woman. You actually get Oriens far more being said not to be a woman, but to be of an effeminate face or nature or visage. So we don't just have the idea of like, are demons, do they have a gender, but also do they cross dress? Are they drag fabulous? There's a couple ways that this gets interpreted. One is that this demon is so deceitful it will pretend to be a different gender. The other is that it's deceitful from this misogynist angle of like, well, of course, a deceitful spirit would appear as a woman. But then, yeah, there's also all sorts of notions uh, around the femininity of the spirit, especially by the time we get to the German Honorius text, which describes them as a crowned woman on tall horse, teaching secret knowledges and healing sicknesses, that her kingdom is in the west, and the name given, Neama, is very closely related to Nahima or Nama,
yeah.
who is canonically a demon queen Jewish traditions, and that this idea of connecting a spirit of the thing called Goetia, which is, at least by the early modern period, and certainly by today's standards, a huge grab bag of various different spirits that church authorities don't like or are skeptical or suspicious of, and connecting this spirit to far older traditions concerning categorical demon queens, which I find fascinating. So the other
Yeah.
part of that is yeah, how often they don't just turn up alone either. As you said, they've got in one of the officoriums, the one republished by Taitian Press. Paimon's a he, but appeareth like a king with a woman's face, crowned with a bright crown. He rideth out on a dromedary, and after him cometh a great company of all spirits and all manner of instruments of melody. But if he be called alone, then he appeareth with two kings, and speaketh mystically, for he should not be understood. Nevertheless, thou mayest command him to speak in thine own language. He hath infinity of spirits under him, but 12 of these, of the mightiest be these. And it then follows the classic arrangement of the 12 spirits under each of the cardinal courts of the compass rose, so to speak, which includes like Belial and Mr. Lass and a bunch of other spirits as well. So we have this sense of a spirit that does all sorts of different things. If we're going to talk about offices, this sense of facing, there's a bunch of protocols that go with that, facing the West, that they will speak truthfully once you ask them in the right way, that they'll reveal hidden things, they'll give honors and high offices, as well as like categorical healing. They'll speak of the state of the world. They will make all the fishes of the sea be obedient, in one case. They teach all sciences and manifest all hidden things again, and again, dignities and great lordships, and bring malefactors to plead for the master's mercy openly, interestingly. By the time we get to Scott, we've got and the building into by the time we get to the thing called the Ars Goetia of the Lesser Key of Solomon or the Lemegeton, we have all sorts of stuff about protocol that seems hinted at before, but seems far more developed out, and also borrowing from the offices of other spirits, where they are constrained by divine virtue to stand before the exorcist when he putteth on the likeness of a man. In this case, the dromedary is actually said to be a swift runner, and first appeareth with a great cry and roaring, as in the Circulo Solomonis, and in the art as it is declared. And if the Solomon speaks sometimes that the conjurer understand him not, so again, this sense of not necessarily speaking in words that are understood, be not dismayed. But when he hath delivered the first obligation to observe his desire, he must bid him also answer him distinctly and plainly to the questions he shall ask of you, of philosophy, wisdom, and science, and all other secret things. And this is interesting to me in terms of when spirits turn up and are obliquely mystical, or do that thing that we talk about with the Enochian spirits seeming to really enjoy doing, which is, yes, I can find treasure for you, but first I'm going to talk about the nature of the cosmos, why the planets are in the order they're in, and the eventual fate of the entire mysteries of creation. And so this idea of like, you have means and need encouragement to kind of cut through that, and to say like, that's great. Let's talk a little plainer about what needs to happen. And if you all know, it says of the disposition of the world, and what the earth is, or what holdeth it up in the water, or any other thing, or what is abyssus, or where the wind is, or from whence it cometh, he will teach you abundantly. So there's also this notion of like, if you want to get into all that cosmic stuff, like Paimon's your gal as well. So we get the idea of riding on a camel being something that turns up for some other spirits, some of these duplicates or ghosts. Gomori of the Goetia of Solomon, who's called a duke there, and Samon in the Livre d'Esprits, who's called a king, along with the various other kings are said to follow them: Bebal, sometimes Belial, Abalam or Balam or Barsan, and various other forms of that, who can follow them, can and do follow them, especially if they are sighted alone, especially by an offering or a sacrifice. So that concept is still there, interestingly, and we do get that that cat sacrifice thing does come back in a working in Scott, which is for summoning Paimon and two others, and it's not they come as a gang, they come as a triumvirate, and that involves all sorts of things, doing it in a basement or covering all the walls in black. Everyone's in lots of black, and there is a cat skin belt. I think specifically a black cat skin belt that's a vital part of that operation. And it's one of those like not a male merge, insert name of spirit here into a general set of conjurations, a la the Goetia of Solomon. It's a individual like this is the full conjuration, right? A la like the operation for the Alphagor and that kind of thing. So an individual right there. And I think I might be talking out my ass here, but I think they also turn up in the Three Hunters working that's also in um, Scott, which is a forest work that also looks a little bit more like where demonology encompasses fairy as well. So they do turn up with other sets of spirits as a working gang, which again makes a kind of sense of the fact that Paimon is kind of relegated from this position of the four principal spirits by the time we get to the 72 as just another one of them. But having said that, their long form text also describes a bunch of other stuff about Belial and things like that, and seems to suggest that there are not just more protocols because this is a more particular spirit, who's sometimes said to be particularly close to Lucifer as well. But perhaps it seems hinting at this earlier part of the fundamental hierarchy that Vea deliberately hamstrings, it seems, so that he can tell people about these spirits without giving them too much information about how to work with them.
Yes, the any disagreement or argument between which of the rankings a spirit is fascinating because the rankings themselves have changed throughout history.
Yeah.
Of the hierarchy, celestial hierarchies, and the difference between, what like the legions of spirits under Paimon are said to be of mostly of angels, but some of them being powers, and
Yeah.
therefore Paimon would have to be higher than those orders itself, which Paimon is usually either a cherub or I believe a dominion. And the dominions are, celestial firmament spirits.
Yeah, and they're certainly by the 17th century at least, if not earlier, they're categorically talked about as being fairly senior, not just in heaven but in the rebellion. In John Hayden's The Idea of Law, characterized from Moses to King Charles, he talks about the faction in the heavenly courts and the angels scorning to attend this piece of clay. That whole like, I will not serve these lesser beings. And he frames it in very legalistic terms, how they contrive to get habeas corpus for to remove humanity. Um, and he specifically mentions this policy he imparted to Egin, Maimon, Mahaziel, Paimon, Azael, and some others of the hierarchy I will not name here. So again, that sense of like, I'm not giving you too much information.
Yeah.
And the Lightbringer strengthens himself with conspirators. But there is no counsel against God, says Hayden. The mischief is no sooner contrived, but he and his confederates are expelled from light to darkness. And then we get that famous quote from Hayden about, thus rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. A witch is a rebel in physics, and a rebel is a witch in politics. The one acts against nature, the other against order, the rule of it. But both are in league with the devil, as the first father of discord and sorcery.
Hail Satan. Uh,
Hail Satan. I love that guy, Rosemary's Baby, that just does it in such a jolly way.
yeah, it's I don't know. Paimon has always had a lovely attraction for me, and it's not uncommon for, you fall in love with certain entities, demons, and perhaps call certain of them more than others.
Mm.
It's always good to have a king on your side, they say.
Mhm.
The mythical they that they say. I say. But yeah, I'm fascinated by this. Because my introduction to Paimon was through the Lesser Key.
Yeah.
And there's so much other literature that has been out, connecting everything through your work, through Jake's work, through so many other modern scholars that are like, look at the genealogy,
Mhm.
which the relationship of etymology to genealogy is its own kind of like onomastic, like exploration sometimes. But
Yeah.
it's still so important, and it's interesting to like, wait, did I hear you say that one of the ones that can appear with Paimon might actually just be another form of Belial? And then my head goes, wait, what? That
Yeah.
with the very codified experiences of, my working group from the 90s to the 2000s or early 2000s of like, oh wow, okay, that's a different consideration. Um, but that's
Yeah, they're first listed in the 12 under them in the offices of the spirits, dividing it into the four, which is according to De Nigromancia, like is a book of Cyprian. Yeah, Belial is at the very least there, if not also one of the heralds that comes, even if you aren't calling other spirits with them.
fascinating.
Yeah.
And I know the Rudd corresponding of the Shamhavrash is Haziel or
Oh,
Hazel.
okay.
So I know that there is a natural extension of that I have seen Hazel connected to Paimon solely based on that. That's the only
Interesting.
thing I can think of specifically.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
although there's also you'll in like the depths of online research, you see oh God, the blue wood. Um, it's not lignum aloe. It's I'll think of it in a little bit. My brain turned off. But just in collecting, any correspondences that come up.
Yeah.
Um, but and anything any wood that has an unnatural color to it. So of course that extends to it, and I think also includes many people in my experience use things like oud. It's interesting because although Paimon is associated with the West, there's a huge amount of Orientalism that comes in with Paimon.
Right. Well,
At
they're riding a camel. Yeah, which
riding a
we'll
camel.
which we'll get
But one of
into.
three spirits you just quoted that are riding camels, curiously,
Hmm.
um, for the Magi, us the Magi amongst us.
Yeah.
Um, but
Yeah.
yeah, so I do think this notion of the wood when it changes color on itself, whether that's through something like oud, which is an infection, which
Mm.
I just watched a short clip of how the trees are purposely infected, where they're driving like a hot metal iron rod through the tree, making Swiss cheese basically. It's extremely violent, and then they inject and they come back 5 years later, and the tree is healed by making that darker wood, which is the agar wood that people are going after. But my God, it is you feel for the tree in watching this, and but oud itself is such it is, we have the burning bush, we have oud, we have all these other things that over the years I have collected what other people have talked about Paimon as is and otherwise. Um, Also,
Yeah.
very much so that the camel spirits might get associated with the ability to find an oasis,
Mm.
specifically. And that's all very, there's some interesting things that go in there. And I found one, where is it? I don't remember where I found it. It's definitely an internet, who the fuck knows who decided this, but that associates Paimon as specifically of the same family as Bilqis, as the Queen of Sheba.
Hmm.
They're from the same Jinn family, and that her non-human blood allows her to never be harmed by Paimon and anyone associated with Paimon,
Mm.
and that this is why her command of demons is far different than Solomon's ever was. And it's those little snippets of folklore are fascinating. There's definitely a large dose with all of these things. After the kind of demonology craze of a lot of um, personal gnosis being posted online that then gets repeated as I have this gnosis because I read it online, uh, which is its own type of interesting uh, call to arms and it's not clout chasing, it's something else, which is all very in line with these spirits of pride that
Right.
Paimon is always, and probably because of the female form and woman's fates associated with vanity and pride, and
Mm.
this closeness of the spirits to Lucifer is also there too.
Right.
But speaks with a hoarse voice. I did you note though that I found interesting that in the LibreWiki article that they specifically when they go off of like sectioning demons, that someone has gone in and started doing the categories that went from like here's a general description to here's status and rank relationship to hierarchy, appearance, possession. And then talking about Sloane 3824 and the Libera Officiorum Spiritum, describing them as having a hoarse voice. They don't mention possession in the paragraph at all, but describe any description of them having an appearance as it implies not visual, or that
Mm.
the visual perception and auditory perception of Paimon is itself a form of possession, which just
Mm.
studies possession. I'm fascinated that this became a category on Wikipedia under which to put things.
Yeah.
That it describes in there between appearance and powers that they have a hoarse voice, and those works Ver and the Goetia note that he must be commanded to speak, and the Librum Officiorum Spiritum specifying that King Paimon will speak in his native language until commanded to converse in the summoner's own language.
Mm.
So they don't speak unless you tell them to, and they will speak their own language until you tell them to switch, which is just there's some pride there as well.
Right.
Like, I don't have to do what you say. Um,
Hmm. And the idea of being a native language rather than just will speak in a way that you can't understand is a distinction, right? And is very much in keeping with this like eternally churned hummus of the paper trail of these things that like the officers get translated into and out of a variety of languages, but also through a bunch of editors and practitioners' particular experiences and proclivities and things like that. Yeah, what is the native language?
yeah,
If they're a fallen angel, is yeah, again, like the in my experiences, a lot of the spirits in the Goetia do respond to the angelical language we call Enochian. Not all of them favorably, but they can speak it.
yeah, it's
Who's don't
fascinating.
necessarily like it. I'm really interested in this in the musical appearance stuff as well of the instruments of melody as well as the sounds of tambourines and of various endeavors to kind of reverse engineer their appearance by tambourines and the tintinnabulary kind of bells and chiming of metal on metal and things like that that I know a good couple people kind of employ in their work with Paimon.
Yeah, it's interesting. The I remember being in a discussion too about like star assignment,
Hmm.
because I love me some fixed star lore, especially when you're talking about dominions. And
Yeah.
projection of the four royal stars, right? Aldebaran, Regulus, Antares, Fomalhaut. Um, that first off, which also the first three of those are Beheni as well. That the nature of Fomalhaut lends itself extremely well to Paimon, being fish related.
Hmm.
Except that the Watcher of the West is Antares. And
Ah.
there's a difference there. But Fomalhaut, if we can separate from the ancient prescriptions of these things, that Fomalhaut the star has a lovely overlap in lore with Paimon being itself kind of that bluish white, the sea monster that's that is swallowing Jonah. That we go into that kind of Paimon being associated with fishes and the ability to breathe underwater indefinitely. At least by what, like Abramelin, right? That
Hmm.
knowledge of past and future events, clearing up confusion and doubt, making other spirits appear, creating and granting visions and dreams, acquiring and dismissing servant spirits, reanimating the dead for several years, specifically for several years, flight, and remaining underwater indefinitely, and the general abilities to make all kinds of things and all sorts of people in armor appear. Uh,
Ah.
but this connection to fish breathing underwater, and even reanimating the dead, and dreams and visions, that Fomalhaut has a lot of those similar properties. Except that again, that weird thing of like, but Fomalhaut's the Watcher of the South, and it bugs me to high fuck that little thing of like, yeah. Um,
Yeah.
as someone who has a Fomalhaut Heliacal Rising,
Hmm.
uh, but swallow me, Jonah. Oh, it's I suppose it's the whale that's supposed to swallow me. Swallow me, whale. So yeah, I'm very interested in that, and Fomalhaut. There's something there. But again, anybody listening that has some strong associations with other stars, do find me and argue at me. I will be Jake in this instance and be like, I will buy you a drink and let's go talk about this for an I will buy you many drinks. First, third, and fifth rounds are on me. You won't have to buy me a drink past the second round. Uh, as Al's family has noted. Uh, I think that was what I think the most was 5 ciders lined up that I still had to drink, and everybody else was caught up. And I was just like, I can't do this.
Yeah.
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 And I fell
My
asleep in many bars. Uh,
my dad does take hospitality aggressively sometimes. Yeah.
oh my goodness. I don't have enough bladder, and there is not enough toilet in this lovely pub, and the curry was wonderful.
Mhm.
Um, but yes, okay. So I think, I mean, as much as I love to talk about Paimon, Paimon is a short of invoking Paimon and calling Paimon and talking more about even more personal associations and things like that. That's the interesting side of this too, is when people want to talk about demons themselves, like talking any spirits, it comes to a point where like you give a certain amount of information, and then it's really bizarre as to what you can talk about more.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not specifically almost betraying your own gnosis of like, am I allowed to talk about this? Because you also it feels precious, your experience,
Yeah.
if you do have any with a specific one.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a lot of stuff about like, letting something integrate again, these periods of silence around conjuration are for me not just I don't think they're just so that the church doesn't find out and, strip you of your lands and hang you. It's also about things not being spoken so that they can ferment in the heart kind of thing.
Mm,
Yeah.
I yeah, it was who's it was talking with Devin uh just last night about there's a lot of discussion about falling into trance and even the ease of falling into things as simple as and profound as diviner's trance. Uh,
Mm,
and the difficulty that we have as moderns falling into these states, which were I'm not going to proclaim a golden age here. I'm specifically going to talk about just that we're more easily accessible in the past.
yeah.
And I was attending a Harvard conference online yesterday from the School of Divinity, and one of the things that was brought up was like, what's going on with the youth? And the person said, people want to blame social media. They're like, the older is much involved with social media, even if they're not on it. That is where we are as a culture. But that the guest speaker actually traced it back to electricity itself
Mm,
as an interference. And
mm.
that was the start because then we harnessed the ability to change nighttime and
Yeah.
get out of sync with the rhythm. And that whole thing of like, who was it that said the world is in perfect order? You just have to put yourself in it. That the world's not out of order. The world is
Mm.
order incarnate.
Yeah.
Um,
You don't
and
hate Mondays, you hate capitalism. Yeah.
and what Devin was saying of like, they noticed when you don't use your phone for a day, that it is easier to slip into conversation with anything. Uh,
Yeah.
and we have replaced a lot of our conversation with spirits, and especially things like household spirits, in my opinion, with the doom scrolling and the that interaction, because how many people do we know the can fall into the stereotypical witch archetype? They're gonna bump into something and they're gonna give it a name, and it's gonna be now it's a spirit in their house. That
Hmm.
the type of people that inspire me to understand the world around me as the ritual has already begun in so many
Yeah.
people talk about that type of thing. Um, but yeah. I'm
Mm.
very interested in I will follow up on this specific payment ritual you mentioned. I want to read that more. I just as full transparency, that I do not utilize Al nearly as much as I should. And by utilize, I mean just harass him and make me he can give me things. But I forget that there are topics, and it's a good lesson as well that like I feel fairly versed on Paimon and many of the 72 just from working groups of like
Mm.
someone brings up a name and I was like, oh yeah, this and this. And I was like, there's no reason I should remember that. But it's really lovely, and it's a good thing to revisit kind of favorite topics with friends, because I'm like, okay, I don't know this. Like, fuck yeah, this is great. Renew my
Mhm.
interest all over again. And I love the kind of cycles that can happen with that. It's the whole reason of a library, right?
Yeah.
like, good friendships are like libraries of, you get to go through conversations over and over and over again on the topics you love. Uh,
Hmm.
but okay, so extolling the virtues of the thoroughly modern Aloysius. Um, hmm. I
Where do
mean,
you want to go from here?
yeah, I feel like we can jump around a little bit here because we've fulfilled the sacrifice of the saint and the demon.
Hmm.
But uh camel feels really apropos.
Yeah.
I Yeah.
Yeah. So we get all sorts of ideas about like people positing that the steeds themselves might be spirits. There's that, all that Irish mythology about a spirit turning up as someone mounted on an animal, but it's the animal that speaks, and that
Yes.
we're not looking at the right thing, that kind of stuff. Um,
Like a Balaam's ass type of thing.
yeah. I think there's also probably more of an association by the early modern period of a spirit on a mount being senior in some way. It's even if that even maybe especially if that is another spirit that they are above them in some sense. That's certainly what we see with like the planetary spirits and their like spotter's guide in say like the fourth book. But camels are get to have their own mysteries. Like you said, there's a heavy sense of being associated with the quote Orient of them. That turns up a lot in the kinds of Western European texts that we're drawing on to talk about these particular kinds of demonologies. So yeah, happy to, and also camels get us back to some Magian stuff, obviously, which is apropos for our reason for the season on the whole. So yeah, I found Ogden Nash had a little ditty about the camel has a single hump, the dromedary too, or else the other way around. I'm never sure. Are you? Which I wanted to kick off with. Typically, the one-humped Arabian or dromedary, Camelus dromedarius, is from Arabia, North Africa, and India, and the two-humped Bactrian, Camelus bactrianus, is found mostly in the highlands of Central Asia. And the latter is said to be a little shorter and heavier and slower, but also has a longer coat of fur, and that they're both, used as beasts of burden, like as the ships of the desert, but also providing wool and milk and hides and meat and things.
And perhaps sexual services.
Perhaps,
Allegedly. Uh,
if you're very
I,
lucky, I suppose.
I just to revisit real quick the idea of the mounts being spirits. It was
Mm.
specifically um like a fun thing amongst a group of my friends to think of um Paimon's two attendant spirits, which apparently might be Belial, as forming the camel. And that
Mm.
in our and this was because these things influenced, of course, this is how we saw things, but that Paimon was not on a camel when the two spirits were present, and Paimon was on a camel when the spirits were not present,
Mm.
and that there was this belief that the camel is their way of moving with those two spirits in some form, or that the camel is the thing that calls to it, or the sacrifice of the camel in some way allows these other spirits to come, which is the idea of sacrificing the thing that allows you to move through the desert means
Yeah.
that you're setting up camp.
Mm.
That you are establishing, you are making foundation,
Mm.
which is its own obsession, and certainly with these kind of dominions and the lore of like stony meteorites and lots of other things coming in there. But before I digress, also that camels come from North America, as do horses, and then went over to Asia, and then eventually, well, the camels didn't come back, but the horses came back through European conquest. Uh,
Mm.
but they are native to North America, as are camels, and that llamas and alpacas are and vicunas are, the descendants of a similar small rabbit-like camel animal that they first found fossil evidence of in South Dakota.
Huh.
So what the hell? But that happened. That actually there's quite a bit of North American wildlife that specifically went elsewhere in the world and became no longer here. So
Ah,
fascinating.
so they are well traveled.
They are indeed well traveled, and they are so far east that they're also west. Yeah,
Globetrotters.
yeah,
Oh, that's
absolutely.
awesome. Hmm. Most of
But
the
camel lore specifically, because I know that this is brings to mind many things. Obviously, it connects us to Paimon, but there is, of course, the Magi references for you, I would imagine. And there's some traditions of the Magi being all three on camels, but also elephant, camel, horse, representing different kingdoms and different modes of transportation. Uh,
yeah, the United Benetton of the Magi. Yeah. That they come from different places. They're from different walks of life. They're of different stages, like the younger one, the middle-aged one, and the old one. They're from the all the three corners of the world in that model. And so yeah, the idea of their various beasts of burden. For me, I like working with primarily camels so far, and get all sorts of camel bone beads and other materia for Magian work, as well as. And I had a question about this on the help desk for practical magicians that I've got on my secret library of a Patreon, about someone saying I'm just reading your Magi book and I'm curious, like, how do we work, like what do we work with them for, which was really interesting in terms of talking about both, like, well, the spells and prayers and amuletic assemblages do have particular functions, right? Protection, travel, tirelessly traveling. The eclipse myth in their hagiography, that that one of them was further along the road towards Bethlehem than the others, and so God puts an eclipse down so that he has to wait at a three way crossroads, trivia, so that he can meet his others. So this idea of, like, there's Magian stuff about what to do when you don't know what to do, when you are, when the way is dark, and you can wait at crossroads for your companions. Other specific things, detection, patronage of astrology, obviously, but also that they form this, broader set of tutelary shades that allow us to um, look in the same direction and find shared values with a variety of dead magicians from different periods of time, from different cultures, maybe even from different religious backgrounds and observances, as the Magi kind of were from that thing. And so this idea of, practically speaking, of maybe invoking the Magi before working with other dead magicians, or even using their statuary and iconography to stand in place of working with a magician we don't have an image of, as well as this sense, more personally, I guess, that their earliest Christian cultus was about the journey, that we follow them in the journey of our lives and into our deaths. And so the idea of them as a folk nigromantic muster point and kind of exemplar, to one day be helpful dead magicians ourselves. Which, all of which is to say that was my reflection on how, like, camel bone, yes, I use for particular things that are about the Magi, but also is one of the materia, like gold, frankincense, and myrrh, that I'll use for other things to lend that virtue and support to them. Theurgy and thaumaturgy, I guess. So for me, for instance, to talk about Magian steeds, I just found myself using the angelical, the Enochian of Lethith Mongog Yolcam Pir, the beasts of the field who carried forth the holy ones. And that's a nice umbrella term, because that then gets to cover the horses and the elephants as well if we want.
that's lovely.
I mean, in terms of camels specifically, and again, we can, like, go back and forth on Magian themes here. They are, funnily enough, for beings that might have started in North America, and I'm still processing that, but associated with hot places, they are regarded as very hot by nature. They are, on the one hand, referred to in, like, Edward Topsell's History of Four-Footed Beasts as, like, wanton and full of sport and wrath, braying most fearfully when they are angered. They're very renowned for spitting very accurately, and in some cases maliciously. But interestingly, they also um, exercise this faculty or distinction from their, like, wantonness, that it's said that when they are to engender, they go unto the secretest places they can find, herein excelling in modesty. interestingly, which is some interesting choleric mysteries there around like, yes, choleric is about like anger, but there's also a strong sense that that the choleric temperament is about duty and about doing things the right way. And so the sense of like obeying a natural modesty in how they reproduce, even though they are themselves, have a pep in their step and a fire in the loins, which I find fascinating.
Mm. Hmm.
They're said to be kind of antagonistic. They have an antipathy with horses. Um, it said that in some cases their hatred, in some cases their fear is so great of a horse that, as Xenophon saith in the Institution of Cyrus, when the armies came to join, neither the camel would approach the horse or the horse to the camel. So again, this idea that like the comradeship of the Magi overcame species antagonisms, that we're not so different, you and I, that friends from rival camps can become comrades on the road is, I think, pretty awesome. As well as like obviously talking about different cultures and their preferred means of steed, and framing that in terms of war and conquest and things. But there's also just, especially when we start getting into the heraldry, which again I think it's useful not just in terms of getting at the emblematics of beasts, but also an angle that I'm still continuing to explore and would encourage other people to, around looking at not just the alchemical meanings or innuendos of emblems of animals, but also their heraldic meaning. That does see, in terms of thinking about spirits like Paimon and others, like what does it mean that Oriens is sometimes said to have 100 horse heads, right? What is being transmitted there? Again, if we look to the records of Edward Kelly's visions, he's frequently making plays on language and connections and gnosis with existing heraldic cant, right? It's a part of the language of not just the virtues of the blood of a particular animal, but also like what they mean and inspire and how they cohere meanings across things. So
Mhm.
for me, yeah, again, big heraldry is not just for rich fancy people. It's also a way of connecting to how pre-modern people would have thought about image, emblem, which I'm really trying to use and distinguish from just symbol or symbolism, which we've talked about before, spitting like camels about it. So when we get into like what camels are in heraldry, there's some interesting stuff. I was reading through David B. Appleton's stuff, where, for instance, he quotes like a 15th century heraldic manual and bestiary, right? So that those two things are already crossing. And again, a bestiary isn't just a list of the tongue of a panther is good for this. They're also moral tales. They're also like fables on and parables on like how to live a good life. But in that particular armory, it says the camel betokens that he is that first bore him in arms was a great lord, wise, unyielding, and mighty, and suitable for battle, humbling himself and ready to take the charge of his subjects, and right patient in his deeds. So there is this sense of like the camel is not patient because it is naturally a slow or phlegmatic or melancholic beast, but has marshaled its own tendencies towards choleric quickness, and it is a patience that has been learned and practiced, which I think is really interesting. But there are loads of different interpretations for what a camel means in armory. So they do talk about patience or discretion or prudence, which again, that thing about how they supposedly make the camel with two backs with four humps, depending on the kind of camel, in private, but also expeditiousness. Some people do get into their full sloth. Others talk about endurance or perseverance or like indefatigability. But Appleton actually makes the point that like the idea of a so-called quote symbolism of most heraldic charges and tinctures doesn't have as much basis in fact as we might like it to. It isn't as simple that everyone agrees that this animal symbolizes this thing, because it's not about a symbol. It's not about standing in place of. It's not about a representation. It's an instantiation of something, and that's different, right? And this is how he talks about the fact that different heraldic authors give directly opposite meanings, expeditiousness and sloth. Um, so we can look to more of the history of them, where, for instance, they're used by the Romans as the personification of Arabia itself. It goes that far back. And so we get that on like Roman coins from the first and second centuries. And that same symbolism is very much carried on today. We see this in the guilds of London, which I'm most familiar with, but we see it with other European cities and their guild structures as well. For instance, various merchants, dealers in tea and coffee and spices and sugar would issue medallions with camels on them from the 16th century well into the 18th and 19th, as this symbol of the Orient from whence came their, tea and coffee and spices and things like that. And that's really where it starts to be this symbol, not just of like a means of getting through a desert or an alternative to a horse, but also just a symbol of trade and commerce. And it's met, says Peter Spurrier in the Heraldic Art Source book, of met most frequently in the arms of companies who trade in the East. So the Worshipful Company of Grocers, for instance, of the City of London, has a golden camel on a black background with a blue bale charged with 6 cloves, and cloves are the symbol of all spices. They're the metonym for all the spice stuff. Sometimes you'll see garbs, the wheat sheafs, which represents like any and all kind of agricultural produce. And one of the other things about, I think I was watching a little documentary on the Grocers Guild, the Worshipful Company of Grocers, is that the camels are also always facing the direction of the east. So when they have like, when they do their dinners and stuff and lay out all these camel-shaped, gravy boats and actual little statues of them, they're always facing east. And even in the heraldry, there's ways of talking. I think the east is usually like left on a two-dimensional kind of shield, and they're always facing that way, interestingly. So they are facing the direction they came in as well, which is that thing about like facing the west versus like being in the west and facing the north or something, right? I think about that kind of stuff. Yeah, so they have this wealth of associations of bringing treasures, I guess, of being involved in trade and commerce. And as such, and that's kind of their most consistent modern heraldry. And so this, yeah, again, the Orientalism of it, the mixture of like war into peace, into, politic being war, continued by other means. This idea of, yeah, indefatigability of travel, of bringing riches, of and yeah, of with the Magi making friends with the horses, as opposed to being so antagonistic with them.
Mm. You brought up the point of east being on the left.
I think so. It might be the right. I would need to watch that little documentary again.
It might go back and forth. I do know that there are many times where east is on the left, a la or a horoscopic chart, right?
Yeah, that would make sense, right? So maybe it is them coming from the east. I remember like when they're three-dimensional and they can actually face in physical space, it was that. And yeah, you might be right. Yeah, and again, the shield as horoscope is also fascinating anyway, right?
Yeah, and it's called has a name in heraldry. Which way they is it attitude?
I think so. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Which also covers like is the lion rampart, or is it couchant and all that kind of stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, and because the shield is carried in the left hand, that changes how things go, right?
hmm
So facing east when the shield is carried in your left hand as a heraldic device means it's, what does that mean? But they assume, you're facing that's why it all goes a certain way, is that
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
a handheld thing. And that's why it can be mirror image sometimes.
yeah.
Around.
I
Uh,
was also reading a thing on in the course of this, just reading on general history of heraldry stuff, which points out this whole idea of like distinguishing yourself from other great houses that you are battling for and against, um, is somewhat questionable. There's not as much heraldry at the time it's meant to be so big as there is a kind of medievalist revival in the early modern period of it.
mm,
And they also pointed out that it was just a plate of like here are like a selection of 30 different like heraldic shields, and they're all just a lion with red and white, like all of them. So not just like, oh, we have a lion as well, but we make it blue. Like just
Yeah.
how many weren't really that distinguishable because everyone loved lions, right? Because lions were having a moment. Um, and but which is also relevant for us thinking about trying to overly dictionary eyes or monster manual, like, oh, this emblem always means this and it never means this. It depends who's using it and what they're how they're riding that camel, so to speak.
Mm, that's fascinating. Yeah. I a couple of things on just tangential research
Hmm.
of the Camelopardalis constellation, which is in Ptolemy's 48 constellations, but is, not one of Ptolemy's 48, excuse me, was created by in the early modern period, early 1600s. And it's faint stars, and it's not particularly, because it's not an ancient constellation, it's not necessarily as revered in that way, but there is a giant spotted camel constellation. It
Hmm.
is its stars tend to be wrapped into, which I found the rabbit holes that we go on right in research, that there are a series of um, star groupings called enclosures in Chinese astrology, or astronomy as well. And so the stars of the camel leopardess constellation make up part of the purple forbidden enclosure, which is just a lovely name.
Oh, that's
And
awesome.
the past that though, there's some lovely lore from the Southwest of the United States, called specifically dealing with the red ghost.
Hmm.
And the red ghost is one, there is the red ghost is memorialized or immortalized in a city called Quartzsite in Arizona. But so the red ghost was it's a cryptid that's not a cryptid. It's so camel expansion, right? It's during the westward expansion of the United States, the military was looking for ways to get across the fucking arid regions of the states.
Hmm.
And so they didn't want a train to break down in the middle of nowhere. So during the early 19th century, there were, before trains became highly popular, but the camels were used as pack animals. And specifically, the pre-Civil War, they were put out into the West and it was called Camel Corps, like corpse, but we don't
Yeah.
pronounce the right. So they got different camels from around the Mediterranean. They got 70 of them. And because of the Civil War, it was abandoned. But you had, and Jefferson Davis, by the way, was one of the main supporters. So big Confederacy support for this camel thing because it involved imports, right?
Mhm.
So in order to do this, it had to do all these things were going on. And the West was in bed with the South through and through. They weren't slave states, but their economic interests were tied into the South.
Hmm.
Um, anyway, so the camels were sold off or abandoned, and some were seen for decades just roaming the Arizona and New Mexican deserts. And
Damn.
so this also led into local traditions of Magi lore of leaving hay out for the camels was a real thing.
Yes.
Because there were wild camel herds. In addition to that, you get these figures like the Red Ghost, which is an 1880s legend where two men go out to check on their cattle and they hear a commotion and they see a huge reddish colored beast ridden by a devilish looking creature. And the Red Ghost is a giant red camel with a bleached human skeleton on its back. And this figure is seen all over Arizona, especially in the 1880s up until the 1900s, and when it's said to have died, but it trampled a woman who was on her property and I believe in her garden. One person said that they saw the camel like pound a grizzly bear to death. A cowboy tried to lasso it but was knocked to the ground and nearly killed. And everybody sees the skeleton. They see the skull looking at them. So
Hmm.
there's, a few months later, it was said that it took 5 men to take down the Red Ghost. But they did shoot the head of the skeleton off. And there was skin and hair, but they didn't take it down, but they missed the camel, but they took the skeleton down, as
Hmm.
it were. So the legend was around for quite a while. And I believe there was a farmer who found it eating in the yard, shot it and killed it in a single shot. It was then discovered that it was indeed a camel with leather straps on its side. so tight that it was scarred. So
Mm.
it still remains unknown why a dead man was on it, but
Yeah. Yeah,
everybody.
that only solves part of that, right?
Yeah, so like this legend was actually true. That there was a
Mm.
dead man attached to a camel that it couldn't get it off it. And so, the records have been lost in those parts of the world too, like certainly just the census records are destroyed often in the early 1900s because of fire and stuff like that, quote unquote. But there is this memorial to the Red Ghost in Quartzsite. I think it's in Atlas Obscura, and in other, fun little sites of interest too is because if you're going to talk about camel corps, nearby in Quartzsite is the monument to High Jolly, who is it was an Ottoman who was hired in 1856 to drive the first herd of camels. And High Jolly comes from Haji Ali, or that was so it's just the Americanization, and they call them High Jolly. Um,
Mm.
but he called himself that after he did the Hajj. And he's actually got a lovely pyramid monument also in Quartzsite. So if you're ever going to be in Quartzsite, go look for the Red Ghost. It's a metal sculpture, and go look up High Jolly's lovely pyramid monument for the history of camel herding in the Southwest.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, that was my book report.
I love it. I love it.
It's interesting thinking about the because in some of the descriptions of Paimon's right, Paimon, we do get command of the winds,
Yeah.
specifically there, and as is appropriate for a king of a direction, right?
Yeah.
Or a crown. Well, here's the thing: is like woman king is king to me in my head. I don't, it's the I know there's the queen consort and queen ruler, queen Regina.
Right, right, right. But also, party girl is a gender neutral term, right?
Yeah. Well, if we're using it correctly. Uh, but I'm also it reminds me of the invention of women. Um,
Mm.
that book is such an interesting by it's Oyeronke Oyewumi. So her proposal in being trained and looking at specifically in looking at Western feminism, she wanted to go back to Nigeria and look for evidence of the same levels or progression of feminism in Nigeria. And she realized that she was imposing the Western model so much that she was ignoring an alternative history of what was going on. And what she uncovered was that, for instance, the timeline when you trace specifically Yoruba history is very off, because when the British came and asked them, who are your kings? They asked what a king was, and they said male rulers. So they listed the male rulers.
Hmm.
They did not list the women who served in the official role as king.
Right.
And that is because the Yoruba terms, it seems, were not based in gender, but in role.
Yeah.
So you can be a king, quote unquote, who is male or female. You can also be a consort who is male or female. You can be a queen who has male consorts and also female wives who then the male consorts could sleep with, and all those children belong to you. Um,
Mm.
so it's an interesting cultural shift that in looking for and imposing Western ideas of things that we can ignore the alternative histories
Yeah.
of what is actually there. But it's anyway, that whole idea of we didn't list the women kings because
Yeah.
you told us kings meant male.
Right.
It's fascinating. Um, and a really lovely oversight warning there. Wins anyway. To get back to this, that the Mesoamerican Tonapwali tonali that we're looking at from the Tonopali is specifically Ehekat. Ehekat is wind. So
Mm.
there's a lot of all these day signs have a ton of lore about them. Um, but specifically, if we're going to look at Ehekat again, the Mesoamerican calendar, that is the Tzolkin when you're dealing with Maya, or the Tonopala if you're dealing with Mexica or Aztec. There's 20 day signs interacting with 13 numbers. Every number has its deity associations. Every day sign has its deity associations. And then together, those groupings may also have deity associations as well. And that you were given a calendrical name for the first part of your life, and you were given an individual name later on when your personality was revealed. But that it was not uncommon to refer to deities and famous officials by their calendrical names sometimes. So we know what the birthdays of the gods were in this manner, and that it links you to those things, in addition to the patron deities of certain days animating different parts of your body or being related to, and therefore every person's birthday reflecting a certain demeanor and disposition towards certain theot. The Theo specifically is the point.
Right. A little astrological point there. That's a really great way of framing how, yeah, it gets to be a pre-Columbian deity associated with the wind, and a creator god, and a culture hero, and a bunch of people, and
Yeah,
and a kind of time-based identifier and qualifier for any and anyone born around that time.
yeah. So Ekat as wind is specifically this wind mask that Quetzalcoatl wears. So Quetzalcoatl is very famous because in many history books they will cite that the Aztecs, which is a term applied from the 1800s back onto the Mexica, but is now so synonymous it's hard to get away from that. But it's believed that that was done by early archaeologists to try and separate the modern Mexican population from an inheritance of the Mexica, and because it was too close in name, so they wanted to distance it as if it was a separate group of people.
Mm,
So Aztec, which was a term used for a larger population of the triumvirate and things like this. But the idea here that Hecat is a specific mask that is emphasizing Quetzalcoatl's role as the wind god, and that Quetzalcoatl was the god, quote unquote. I wouldn't necessarily translate Teotl as gods, but it is what it is. That Hernan Cortez was felt to be, because Quetzalcoatl in his stories went into the East, was bearded and red-haired, and
mm,
taught amazing technologies. But Quetzalcoatl is also the ancestral god of Tula and the Toltecs and these different cultures, because the Aztecs were coming in and in 250 years just kind of absorbed every other culture in that Central Valley. And rose. It was very Roman. It was
mm,
extremely Roman. Let's go
mm,
in. We're going to take our seeded of things going. We're going to create a holy city that is in the middle of a lake, a swamp, and we're going to start conquering the areas around, and everybody will have to give tribute, and we're going to absorb those cultures so they can see how they fit into the grand design that we as are the special caretakers of. So
mm,
Quetzalcoatl is not the only native god of the Aztecs, supposedly, especially the war god, who, if history is correct, then he would have come from like the Four Corners region of the United States with the Aztecs when they left 400, 600 years earlier.
mm,
They wander down and they're poor people and they come to this swamp and they do this stuff. Anyway, Ehecat, Ik in Mayan, this day, is ruled by Quetzalcoatl, who's the theot of intelligence, reflection. He's the patron of priesthood.
mm,
He's also known as White Tezcatlipoca in the origin myths when the primordial couple produces the directions through their mating, that there are different colored Tezcatlipocas. And Tezcatlipoca is his own god, but Tezcatlipoca is also mystery. And so therefore the white Tezcatlipoca is a different mystery from the red Tezcatlipoca, is different from the blue.
mm,
That they have these emanations where they are reflecting each other, that one reflects the other, and therefore they move further in distance apart and grow in difference from each other. So the white Tezcatlipoca, and also known as Tlalhuizalpantecutli and Ehecatl, is just a name given that he's the wind itself. This is the feathered serpent. This is the serpent Kukulkan in Maya that descends the pyramids during certain of sunlight that you see, and the giant kind of half cat looking, half serpent things, that the heads that you see on the bottom of temple architecture.
yeah.
This is the god who, in the current age, went and stole the bones from the lords of the dead and pierced his penis, and blood was poured upon those bones to create us, to create the life of this age. He's also the one that gives corn to the people of this age. So this is, in this time period, is an extremely life-giving God. This is the breath of life. This is the sustainer. This is the kind of messianic Jesus Gandalf figure that comes in to help us, that teaches us the way of being in tune with nature, and is also like his downfall. For instance, was drinking too much. Tezcatlipoca wanted to have him because Tezcatlipoca will always test people who are holier than thou. And
Mm,
abstinence, and he gets him drunk, and Quetzalcoatl ends up sleeping with his sister and leaves his kingdom in shame, and all these things happen. Um,
mm,
But
Because he gives the gift of the century plant, right? The American aloe, agave americana, right? Meguri, Meguri.
Magay, Magay,
Yeah, yeah.
Magay,
From which you make the fermented alcohol drink, right? The
yeah, pulque,
pulque. Yeah,
pulque,
pulque.
yeah, pulque, and then when you distill pulque, it's tequila. Or
Mm,
yeah, that is actually there's a whole larger myth there where in order to because humans life was miserable and that alcohol is specifically given to the world and Quetzalcoatl goes and finds Mayahuel sleeping amongst her family, her aunties, her grandmothers, the Tzitzimime, the star demons, the star ladies, and basically kidnaps her and puts her into the earth and she becomes a plant
mm,
and that she is the goddess of Magay, Mayahuel, of the plant itself, and then she has the god I think it's two rabbit, right? Is the god of pulque and medicine and joy and things like that.
mm,
But the day itself is considered bad for working with others, like follow your own instinct. Influences are they tend to be it's very easy to be influenced by your own projections here on this day.
mm,
And it's a good day to sit there and root out bad habits. Uh,
mm,
it has other influences based on which numbers it pairs to, 1 through 13, because again, those have their own energies. But as because of the 13-day periods that go, Ehekat is also the ruler of a Tresena. So when Ehekat is one Ehekat, it becomes the ruler of the Tresena. And this is considered the return of the divine whirlwind. I said whirlwind. Wow. And so here, order and reason kind of grow stale and outlive their purpose, and the old has to die to make way for the new. This is also the third Tresena from the end, if I remember correctly. So
mm,
like the year is starting to die, and the Aztec year being this specific Aztec year because there's also one that's matched the agricultural year. This one is the 260-day one, which wrote so your birthday will go through all seasons as you age. Like you'll have the experience of that because 260 does not into 365 make.
right.
Um, so you have to lightning strikes the heart of order here is the phrase. And so here the Trecena itself is ruled over by a different deity. It's no longer ruled over by Quetzalcoatl. It's ruled over by Chantico. Chantico is literally means she who dwells in the house. She's the goddess of the hearth.
Mm,
And she herself is also sometimes the wife of or heavily connected to Xolotl, who many people know is the twin brother of Quetzalcoatl, and the shadow form that's like his Nahual. It's his sorceress double.
mm,
And Xolotl by some is considered to be the dead twin, as it were, that goes with him into the underworld and like can do things that Quetzalcoatl cannot do on his own. But Xolotl is heavily connected to dogs and the dead, which are inextricably linked in Mexica thought, because when you die, it is a Xoloitzcuintli, shadow dog, that manifests and leads you through the underworld for 4 years until you get to the throne room of the Lord and Lady of Death. And most people after 4 years were obliterated because we didn't live excellent lives,
mm,
where our bones are recycled to make the bones of the future. But
mm.
Chantico is the hearth, and she's associated with dogs because dogs gather by the warm hearth.
Yeah.
And she herself was turned into a dog because she broke a fast with by eating paprika covered fish, and that's studying this a few years ago was when I realized that paprika was nothing but roasted red pepper and scammed, and another thing that was like all peppers coming from the New World, true peppers, was one of those things of like paprika, like many things, is apparently has its origins in Central America.
Mm,
And she is an extremely jealous and wrathful deity, and she has to be pampered, which makes sense for any hearth deity, right? Like, don't let her
mm,
take over. Um,
mm,
in this time period, like these are days of instability and insecurity that are ruled by Hecate. So no relationship is better than bad relationships. Like
mm,
don't lend your heart out here. And so there's just it's these are hard days, even though they're ruled by Quetzal. The day is ruled by Quetzalcoatl, and is not a terrible day, but is one of those days for self-reflection is better to kind of pull back. And the 13-day period ruled by Hecate is actually pretty hard to,
mm,
things don't make as much sense during that time period. And
mm. The winds are blustering and scattering and
Yeah, yeah.
wailing
Something
around
they're
us.
bringing something new, and you don't know what it is yet.
Mm, mm.
So
So reading about how the cardinal direction winds, or maybe the winds are themselves said to have come from the underworld.
yes, well, most things come from the underworld in some form. And there's a lot of literature that's attacking this conception of, like, in the very classic sense, if we take it at face value, that these documents were written between 50 and 200 years after the conquest by native painters who were then interviewed and written down. But Sahagun and others that are the Molina, that are doing these incredibly adept descriptions of cosmology and advocating for the indigenous having souls,
Mm,
because it's too complex. There was a big thing if you read the diaries of the conquerors, of the conquistadores. The city is the largest city in the world at the time. It has a library, and we sit here and are told that there was no library. They burned the books. It was
mm,
that's how you enslave the people.
yeah.
But we don't know if the layers of the underworld are truly 9 layers of the underworld, or if it's these layers are more influenced by Dante,
Mm.
which was in heavily in vogue, much like a red lion on a white shield. Uh, and so the priests could have adapted a lot of local descriptions to make these 9 levels of the underworld, which is lovely. But really, the underworld in modern indigenous practice echoes what is in folk tales, which is there's 5 regions because there's 4 directions and a center. And
Mm.
so there's the north of the underworld, there's the south, there's the west, and there's the east. And that there are also deities that are holding up the vault in many of the stories, including in Maya and other groups as well. And so the mountain passages allow certain breaths of the dead and other things to escape into this world. And the directions themselves are, of course, heavily, it's how order is brought. So
Right.
there's a lot of lore, with different winds, with the different every sign is associated with a direction. Every 13-year period is associated with a direction, or 13-day period, excuse me, associated with direction. And therefore, even the larger groupings of years, there's only 4 signs that they can be, and those are, this is a west year, this is a north year,
Yeah.
and they themselves have associations very strongly in those directions too.
Right. Right. How we orient ourselves.
Literally.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Hmm. Yeah. So it's yeah, it's a great take on what to do when things don't look favorable, right? Like
yeah.
again, what to do about the bad conditions, not just to say, "Ooh, oops, all towers."
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, because the documents too that we have, of they were very, you can go anywhere from pessimistic to realistic, of when a baby is born, like telling it that life is shitty and hard.
Mm,
And there's few pleasures, so make the most of what you can do and be a good citizen of the state, and offer your blood because the gods gave their blood for us and we owe them blood, which is probably a good segue to blood sacrifice.
yeah.
But that in the gods actually sacrificing their lives and returning in some form, that humans themselves then owed the precious substance, which was like jade, which was viewed like copal, that there were substitutes. Yes, there was absolutely human sacrifice, but was it at the level that the Spaniards proposed, which would probably be physically and numerically impossible? Uh,
Yeah.
Instead, it was token victims that, rather than decimate a village, they didn't kill in battle, they captured. And
Mm,
so instead of killing all the men in a village, they'd take, depending on which god they were serving that month, they would take the handsome one, or they'd take the old man or a child or something like this to go back. And it's very convenient because I don't want to be revisionist in that way, but it's very, the idea that the person becomes the god. There's actually just these ideas and concepts of emblems and what belongs to a god, and what is it when a statue is there versus someone who's portraying a god. And there's
mm,
different classifications for this. There's 5 different classifications of, like, properties of a god. And an emblem is not material, whereas, like, the property is, and the person is enacting the god. And you see this in modern practice, both in extant indigenous, but as well in, like, Aztec dance tradition, which resurrects and tries to put back together. It's a resurgence, but they will paint people once a year as that god. and
Mm.
they live that life. And in modern Aztec practice, they're not sacrificing anyone. The Danza Azteca tradition. But at one point they would have dosed you up with a bunch of sacred substances, fed you really well, and you would have been killed in your state of excess.
Mm.
You were basically a boy bishop. Um,
Right.
had the rights and privileges of the god for as long as they needed you to, and they killed you as the god. Uh,
Mm.
and you were granted a different life, afterlife, if you went through a sacrificial offering in this way. Uh,
Mm.
but everybody promises good things when you get to be the martyr. Uh,
It'll be great, they said.
yeah, it'll be.
Yeah.
I have that weird mixed relationship with Aztec things because it's such the lingua franca of like Chicanismo and like this idea of like harking back to this great empire that Mexico is named for. And at the same time, like my grandfather's people are Otomi, and they were conquered, and they're the original inhabitants of the valley, and just everybody that came in kind of conquered them more, and they were revered. They have their own patron deities within the Aztec pantheon, but they were slaves to that empire too. So there's
Yeah.
this thing of like, I don't have as much access to Otomi mythology because it's detribalized at this point. Like it's been probably a few generations since then any language was spoken in my mother's family. But it's interesting to note that like, okay, the Aztecs probably imbued a lot of their own mythology with Otomi mythology, with other mythologies that are around, certainly Tolteca and things like that. And we don't even know that much about the Otomi anymore because the language is scattered and the people were not allowed to speak their language quickly after conquest and were thrown in the mines.
Right.
Uh, so it's interesting how it all relates, and like what do you do when you're that the notion of recapturing or following ancestral traditions is not something that's always applicable to everybody evenly. But
Mm.
it's also interesting because there is a lot of resurgence that is not just reconstruction, that is actually trying to put forth the indigenous traditions that have survived, both syncretic and otherwise. And there's a decided measure by many to actually adopt distinctly less syncretized, less um, Catholicized version of what is out there. And so are they making things up? No, they're using historical text and inspired by, but that's not the same thing as making things up, in my opinion.
No.
In the same way that like we can see reconstruction groups are very different from those groups that are imposing a specific set of 1950s ideals, in a through a very strong Mariist lens,
Hmm.
and proposing that Medea was worshiping the horn god and moon goddess, as opposed to celebrating that for what it is, which is answering the needs and folk need value centers of mid 20th century Britain, and very largely the American explosion and empowerment that Wicca as a new witchcraft provided, because I might as well not beat around the bush, but beat
Yeah.
around, beat around the drawing of the moon.
Yeah, 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 yeah. The value of historiography, right? The stories of history and who's telling it and through what lenses, and as you said, to answer and foster which values.
Yeah, foster witch values at
Which
that.
values?
Because it's one of those things of right, there's this tendency in the craft. As a Mason, I'm going to specify here that I mean witchcraft specifically. That to ignore specifically some living members' completely made up pedigrees. That there's like, it's why are we ignoring this person's claim to authority through making shit up because they were of value to a community? Sure, but like I don't understand not speaking truth to history.
Mm.
Or maybe people feel that it won't give any value, but I don't see how it's of value to a tradition to lie openly about its history and then inculcate more people into this lie, and then not think that that's going to hurt the tradition in the end,
Yeah.
as opposed to many groups that I have also seen in various quote unquote British traditional witchcraft groups that will absolutely spill out the exact history and are happy to talk about it, and also happy to talk about how this their tradition answers their needs, and that they are quite fond of what was created and how it works for them. And that is a very different attitude.
Yeah.
Um, it's the difference between someone who is studying church history and acknowledges the progression of the ancient church into Roman Catholicism through the Great Schism, through the Protestant Reformation, through to modern, forms of Anabaptism that Anabaptists that are, is very different than saying that you just come from John the Baptist.
Hmm.
And I know we all appreciate good myth, but not, I'm sorry, not at the point of erasure of truth.
Right, 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 right.
Both can exist.
When mystery isn't like generative anymore, and when it's just being used to deceive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I
Mystery.
digress. And probably, full of my own hubris as well there. So speaking of hubris, um, lead, kata, lead, kata, lead,
Lead.
lead.
Let's talk lead for a little bit. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Why not? Okay. Yeah, yeah. Seamless transition. Yeah, okay.
Tracklist, in fact.
Uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh. Yeah, what are the heavy saturnine themes of what is underlying things, and when is a malleable thing like myth useful for getting water to people, and when is it poisoning the well? Okay, yeah, Latin plumbum. You're a plumbum. From which we get the chemical PB, and also, of course,
Nicest thing you've said to me today.
the word for plumbing itself, lead
And pipes.
is, and yeah, 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 yeah. It's a soft metal, malleable, low melting point. It's relatively easy to get out of ore, so we have examples of it being smelted. We have like metallic lead beads dating back as far as 7,000 to 6,500 BCE, found all across Asia Minor. Yeah, very early examples, possibly the earliest examples of metal smelting. Um, the ancient Egyptians seem to have been the first to use lead minerals in cosmetics. That's obviously very popular for that deathly hallow. And that spreads to ancient Greece and then further afield. You've got all sorts of Fertile Crescent civilizations using it for writing material and coins, especially. Um, I was tickled by the fact that it was used to make sling bullets from the 5th century BC, and especially that we found ancient Greek lead sling bullets with inscriptions on them. How much is this amuletic? How much is this blessing the thing? How much is this a certain amount of the gallows humor of war? We find winged thunderbolts molded on one side of some of these sling bullets we found, with the Greek inscription for "take that" on the other side.
Yes, yes.
Um, and I raised that for absolutely no reason related to bullets having things written on them. Again, in the news cycle of late. Uh,
Wow.
so by Cato the Elder and Pliny the Elder, all these elders, we have various recommendations to use lead and lead-coated vessels for especially the preparation of preservatives and sweeteners, especially added to food and wine. And I looked into the chemistry of this, and apparently copper vessels will give you like verdigris formation eventually, which lends a bitter flavor to things that you taste. Whereas the formation of the terrifyingly named sugar of lead, which is lead to acetate, will actually produce, quote, an agreeable taste. And so this also makes sense of why lead was used across the later medieval period and beyond for adulterating wine. Seems to be a way of making it taste better. And we know about this partly because the use of it was forbidden for use in Christian rites by a papal bull in 1498. But it continues to be imbibed and produced a bunch of mass lead poisoning up to and including the late 18th century. One of the useful analogies for its context, especially like in Rome and onwards, was again just pointing out how lead was cheap and was readily available, and yet also regarded as a father of all metals in all of its like saturnine glory. But I found this nice quote from Heinz Eschnauer and Marcus Stopler. They said this metal was by far the most used material in classical antiquity, and it is appropriate to refer to the Roman lead age. in the same way we talk about various stone ages and iron ages. Lead was to the Romans, they said, what plastic is to us, which is a fascinating point, right? Like I think of that meme about, our great grandfathers full of lead, us so much smarter, full of microplastics.
Yeah.
So again, that idea of like what's cheap and what's available and what's used um, in the moment being good, and the fact that like we do have certain Roman writers being like, this seems like when we use it wrong, it makes people really, really sick, but it's
Gotta make
economically
sense,
viable.
yeah.
Yeah, it's economically viable. It's relatively easily available. It's easily extracted. It's thus generally got a low cost, and that's really why lead continued to be used in right in plumbing, in pipes, in
Oh, capitalism.
yeah, yeah, in pewters, obviously, in various other fusible alloys, lead paint, delicious but deadly, right? Leaded gasoline, radiation shielding, right? Those kinds of saturnine values, as well as not just sling shots, but also bullets, batteries, weights. Um, the plumb line, right? Um, and things like that. And of course, as we've been skirting around, lead is also a neurotoxin and causes a variety of neurological problems and disorders, from weird behavioral stuff to actual brain damage, as well as damage to the renal systems of the kidneys and the bladder and so on, and like cardiovascular problems. I was reading some historians kind of claimed for a while that this might have played a significant role in the decline of the Roman Empire itself, that they were all varying degrees of lead poisoned. Um, some, it seems more recent, historians have kind of quibbled and refuted with this, saying that, yeah, lead pipes are not ideal, especially for those who are making them, but that the lead that it added to the water would not, depending on how it was made, generally be significant enough to be truly dangerous. But lead poisoning can cause all sorts of things that have a kind of saturnine vice to them. If we're going to frame saturnine virtues, infertility, a variety of cognitive impairments and intellectual disabilities, constipation. Talk about another kind of retention, memory loss. On the other hand, abdominal pain and various other things. So definitely something that caused a bunch of problems too, which also kind of lends a perspective, I think, to its most famous kind of magical mythology and engagement and practice with European and Arabian traditions of alchemy. That it's the base metal, the impure metal, which by alchemical solvay et coagula and all the purificato in the middle is supposedly transformed to pure and incorruptible gold, right? Making a panacea, a universal medicine out of a poison. Again, a thing that was kind of relatively known to be a little bit poisonous. Um, Lead poisoning itself is known as plumbism, and significantly Satanism, right? It being the saturnine metal in the West, at least, right? I'm aware in like Vedic systems, it's that Saturn rules iron, and they make there are the rings made of the iron from a black horse's shoe. Um, but yeah, I have a bunch of Saturn stuff to get into specifically. But always love hearing your takes on metals and where they're found in the world and things like that. Did you come up with other things?
I mean, there's a few things that come up. I mean, you hit. It's almost like we can research things in the same way. A few things come up with lead for me. It's interesting. I mean, I would highlight the use of lead specifically in the ocean deities or deities associated with oceans in the Afro-Cuban traditions. So like the tools are made of lead for Yemoja and the Olokun are
Mm,
oftentimes in the diaspora because it doesn't corrode in salt water. What's interesting is that lead is primarily the metal, the white metal itself. It's the original because stainless steel is a much more complex metal to get to.
mm,
Steel itself. So lead is actually the Funfun deities. Obatala's bracelets and Oshala's bracelets, the great Orisha's bracelets, and metal, the rod he carries of authority is lead.
mm,
and it's an incorruptible metal, and so you get this slow moving deity also associated with the heaviest of metals in this way.
Mm,
Not the heaviest as a superlative, not as a factual.
mm.
And so that's an interesting side of it. I cannot think of lead without thinking of my godmother. And let me explain that before that becomes the weirdest soundbite ever. Uh, but so in New York, there is now an extensive thing that when you rent any dwelling, the landlord has to have tested the paint for lead. And this is specifically because of the results of my godmother and a few other people in the Young Lords. So they had the Young Lords specifically was a Puerto Rican gang that there was a chapter in Chicago and a chapter that formed in New York that was inspired by the Panthers, and their whole thing was to serve the people. So they weren't just protesting, they weren't just going out and causing damage. They were literally cleaning up the neighborhood because encourage anybody, please go. There's amazing books written about them. There should be more. But one of the things they did is they had a 10-point health program that they had designed that was denouncing profit-driven healthcare. So among the 10 points was that they wanted free publicly supported healthcare for prevention and treatment. So they set up in Chicago, the Young Lords set up a free dental clinic and a free clinic and a community childcare center. In New York, where Denise Oliver, they established free testing sites for tuberculosis, which they did by going and stealing the tuberculosis testing truck that was parked in Riverdale, because all of Upper Manhattan was assigned to the Bronx too. So they had one truck and it parked in the most disease-free area, which was an upper class Jewish area. And they stole it and they brought it down to Harlem and started testing people for tuberculosis and lead poisoning. Each city had to pass ordinances eventually because of things that were brought up. And you were getting people in tenement apartments where the children eating the paint and the children being around certain things were causing a disproportionate amount of healthcare problems. The Young Lords also took over Lincoln Hospital, which is an action you can read about, watch things on YouTube about. Like they're an amazing group. I think to this day they're one of the few quote unquote terrorist organizations that took over a government building and like not one of them went to jail about it. They also consulted the I Ching before every operation, which
How about
you know
that?
I'm doing a series of interviews with Marina about her life and many other things as well. But if you don't know the Young Lords and are interested in political activism in the 60s, 70s, and up until the current day, it's a fascinating group. There's a few of the original members are no longer with us, but there's some good shit out there. And if you don't know Denise Oliver, go follow her on Twitter. She will rant up well, not even Twitter or X anymore. She's on Blue Sky too. But
The
she
daily costs, right?
Daily Cost. She is a blogger on Daily Cost. She does a Black Music Sunday blog and a Caribbean Matters blog every week, and as well is commenting and very commonly yelling at people online in all the best ways. So I adore that woman, and she's responsible for me. So it's her
Mm.
fault. I'll pass. Um, but yeah, so lead in that way, I can't separate it in that way. But that's also interesting because then you have health and radicalism and activism associated with that sets policy in order, which you can't get more saturnine than policy change,
Right, right.
which is interesting in that role between the lead tube of rulership, the lead rod of rulership that is, for weighing things out, how much of the rod that the king holds is about measuring standards, therefore being able to measure property of
Yeah.
like it's related to being able to weigh and measure things. This holding something heavy and holding a rod. So that's I think about that. I think about the Modus Liber again with the alchemical ideals there, and that last line of provided with eyes thou departest and the apotheosis that happens, presumably of going from Saturnine lead to Apolline solar.
Uh,
Apolloian,
yeah.
non-Dionysian, non-Saturnine. Um, Phoebus, Phoebuseian gold. Woo! Okay. Uh,
Auric.
uh, you know, lead curse tablets, love me that scene in Rome, call upon uh Julia the Galli, like the whole thing where she's cursing her and carving into the lead. And these this yeah.
Oh
Um
yeah, yeah, Depicciones, right? Yeah.
yeah,
And associations often with underworld deities and also with getting your stuff back from people that have stolen it.
yeah.
Hmm.
So all that's there. Yeah, I mean, there's lead is interesting because we don't often deal we tend to deal with stones, which
Yeah,
of course have metals in them, but we don't always deal with metals themselves.
right. And an element at that by our modern standard of what elements are.
Yeah, it
Hmm.
is obviously it is toxic to plants. It is not a good thing to be in plants. It causes hormonal changes, membrane structure, mineral imbalance. It inhibits photosynthesis. It can lead to blackened roots and stunted growth. Yeah, I
Hmm.
know there's a number of plants that have lead in them. I'm trying to find that in my note, but like root vegetables, of course, can absorb. So even carrots, beets, potatoes, things like that, you can, if there's lead contamination, it will bring them in.
Hmm.
Lettuce and Swiss chard are the ones that are cleaned with uh they're less likely to contain lead, but these kind of heavier winter greeny leaves can also have lead exposure. And then even any of the nightshades, tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, beans, corn, those aren't nightshades, but they can contain lead through contamination. So it's one of the things when I was studying with Ursula through Herbal Bear, she's an air pollution expert. So she was talking because there was an herbalist who was at the time unsafely recommending that people gather mugwort from the side of the road because it was strong and vigilant. You're like, and it's full of heavy metal poisoning. Are you fucking
Yeah.
kidding me? Like, maybe in the countryside you could go, but you needed to go, and you couldn't just go 10 feet back. We were talking like 150 feet back from well-traveled roads in order
Yeah.
to avoid heavy metal poisoning. So, you know, this is the part of herbalism that requires an actual awareness of pollution and our
Mm.
effect on the environment. That you know, vegetables grown in New York City are a different nutritive value than vegetables grown not in city limits.
Right.
Well, presumably, I mean, in a less polluted area.
Mm.
Um, I don't think going to, right over the border into Long Island is going to make your vegetables any better. Uh, but they're still better than a lot of vegetables that are out there anyway.
Yeah.
I digress. Um, but so lead and just so increased awareness. I also find, I remember it was specifically within, yes, lead is assigned to Saturn, but that I remember being so shocked when going through the Picatrix, whatever, decade and a half ago, of realizing that there were multiple metals associated with each planet. And I was so based in a system that like every planet
Yeah.
has one metal, and
Yeah.
iron was equally Saturnine,
Yeah.
especially in anything Muslim. So it became this whole thing of like, what the fuck? Okay, interesting. And that
Hmm.
find lead associated with the moon as well because of its white character.
Yeah.
And starlight and things like this, especially outside of Europe. So all of that is fascinating as well.
Yeah. Malleable. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. The fact that it changes in the air from that like lustrous blue to a dull gray, like yeah, that's totally lunar. Yeah. Yeah, you do. Yeah, exactly. Like I had similar experiences going through um not just Picatrix, but also like kind of like the Boxgrove manual and things like that with these um planetary sigils, these like metal medallions where yeah, especially like Jupiter, not just tin, but copper, and obviously like gold and silver, the qualities of like precious metals being used for these things. Yeah, and again, highlighting the same thing we've talked about with plants, where like a plant isn't might be talked about as primarily having a particular planetary flavor or instantiation, but can often have several, not just in its applications, but also in its instantiations, like several different planetary allegiances or heritages, if we want to put it like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mixed fruits.
Yes. I would say that there's perhaps a Hmm. Parallel here in Cauda Draconis.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, literally partly ruled by Saturn as well as Mars. So there we go. There's
Yeah.
a double planetary thing. Does have associations with poison. Does have associations with iron weapons. Um, yeah, no, definitely. I think Cowder's a great one to go from there. Um, associated with associated with the term is definitely drawn, nabbed, borrowed as a sister of astrology from the south node of the moon. To what extent it actually refers to those things that um is it an asterism at that point? It's the relationality between Earth, Sun, and Moon. Um, it's its
But
own.
now we're getting into an actual emblem, right? Like it's a concept. It's a fixed point in space, but it is not a physical object.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so by the time we get to particularly European geomancy, it's its own beast at that point. It is the dragon's tail all by itself, and a mirror image of Cauda Draconis, so the dragon's head. Um, very much so, to the extent that in some geomancy handbooks they give the delineations for caput and then say reverse all that for Cauda. They don't bother actually giving you what the reversals are. They just say it's the opposite. So it is defined by an absence in the text as well as what it isn't, which again, how malefic of it. So it's often considered a fiery figure, not exclusively, but I like it as fiery because it feels like a suitable end to this fiery progression of the spark of Pua, the contained forge flame of Fortuna Major, the flammable spread of Acquisitio, and ending in this kind of, or leading to this just destructive wake of ashes from the dragon's tail. Because it is mostly, again, I can't comment too much about Rammel and things, but it is generally a figure of endings, of unpleasant endings at that, destruction, arson, violence, both accidental and deliberate. There are literal cautions about being careful of fireworks in various early modern geomancies where Cowder turns up in like certain places in a shield chart, as well as being wary of like iron weapons. Um, and also the violence done to character from slander and ill words.
Mm.
That's another big theme. It's a mobile figure. It's moving. It's sudden. It's swift. It's changing. It's transforming. If you want to talk about its like form, 1112, right? Active, fire, air, and water lines, and a passive earth line, which is an interesting combination, right? There's drive, there's thought, and emotions all should we say, activated, but the feet fail us in some sense. It's got some negative associations in terms of what it means in a reading as well. It's sometimes called a halting figure, like Rubius. We're instructed to abandon and indeed break a chart that starts with it in the first by some geomancers.
Mm.
I don't observe that rule. I think it's important to look at destruction carefully, but I think there are similar reasons for it for Rubius, which is they're both figures that have capacity to do violence to truth and clarity.
Mhm.
I'll say that a Cowder sentence does often signal like the sentence, the reconciler, the super judge of the non-consecutive edition of the first figure and the judge, like how the client is going to take the reading and what they're going to do with it, is that it can often signify that they're either not going to take the reading well or that they're even going to do something less than helpful about the reading, whether that's like ignore it or um, the pendulum swinging too far the other way, or even in some cases with other stuff going on in there. That they, that can be one of the starting points of signs towards them going away and saying bad things about the diviner.
Mhm. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it can be a marker of a querent being affected by active cursing, but it's also a great figure for breaking enemy work for counter magic. It's definitely a sign to throw out that haunted amulet or that creepy doll. Sorry, not
Editing.
sorry, Sasha. It breaks a fever and otherwise signals an end to illness and the sixth. I think we talked about that before. Um, it can usher a radical shift that shakes us out of bad habits, even if we like have space for that destruction to be used in a constructive way.
Mm. Mm.
So themes of violence and of endings of things, not being a good time to begin things, but a good time to bring things to their conclusion before they are brought to conclusion for you, or at you, or with you.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's so the corresponding Odu, right, is Ogunda.
Mm.
And we see obviously the same intrinsic relationship between Ogunda and Osa, being Osa being equivalent to Caput Draconis, same form. And in these two, I would say especially in Cauda Draconis, there's so much overlap, more than many of the others, in that way. But you get proverbs of this sign when translated into English. So I'll use Stuart's Ochonileles, but tragedy, deception, and despair are near. Tragedy is brought by making the wrong decisions. Tears can turn into laughter, but only laughter will again become tears. That which was lost will eventually come back. Good deeds will not go unrewarded. Evil deeds never remain unsanctioned. On entering a low door, one must bow the head. Beware those who come bearing gifts. As you've sown, so will you reap. Those who fight with the sword will die by the sword, type of mentality.
Mm.
So the way this was described by my godmother when I asked her about this once specifically, and I'll quote her on this because again, I'm not going to propose to be an expert here or try and make other people experts, but Ogun, the deity, is heavily here in Ogunda. And Ogun in this sign is, she described him like a machete that was always chopping. And so Ogun has to clear things here. Ogun has to cut down. Ogun is the actual road opener. Eshu or Elegwa is the one who walks the roads and knows them all. But Ogun is the one that cuts them open. So Ogun is just chopping. And if you can direct him to clear the forest, it is productive, but it is still destruction. If you direct him to clear that field over there, it is productive, but it is still destruction. If you do not direct him, he will go through a village. He will go through the market. And so destruction is an edge that now, that sword that must be guided. And Ogun is always intrinsically connected to metal.
Yeah.
As the deity of iron, Gu, Ogun, Ogu, across the diaspora. We see Ogu in so many forms. He is such a primal deity in West and Central Africa in various forms, whether it goes from the Gu of the Fombe to Ogu in Haiti to Ogun in Cuba, into Ogun in Brazil and Trinidad and so on and so forth. But always tied into blacksmiths, warriors, the acts of violence itself. And this is also interesting because Ogun in a different tone, and I'm bad with Yoruba tone, so I will not pretend, but being a tonal language to how you say the vowels, what pitch you say them on, does different words. And so Ogun is also medicine, things that can help us. So that can also be, the cuts to the skin that allow body medicine, on both a chemical and apotropaic, there we go, level. So there's lots of ways to consider this, but I like the earth is what is, it's not grounded, right? Everything else is there, and yet it is so much the child of earth. This is pure, as much as Thor is a thunder god. It's just this, there's kind of this like, he is the child of earth, right? There's a similar thing of like destruction will happen here. Ogun is, and I'm not saying Ogun is like Thor, it's just a deity that comes to mind as one of those ones that has a reputation for kind of being literal and destructive.
Blunt.
Yeah, blunt. So Ogun has many stories about him in many ways, and Ogun is not the only deity that speaks in this sign, so I'm not trying to propose that. But Ogunda itself, to understand that metal is something that must be guided, and all technology is Ogun, but so is, the car is Ogun, but so is the car accident. The ability of an airplane to fly through the air is Ogun, but so is the bullet, so is the machete, so is the gun itself. All of these are Ogun. And so there's something, it's a control mechanism, can be used to control, but it can also must be controlled. And that thing of like guns don't kill people, people kill people. Both the gun and the people killing people with guns are Ogun.
Right.
So it's Ogun is also the surgeon's scalpel and the thing that can excise disease and help us. And again, clearing a field, clearing a forest to settle, to chop down trees to make timber. All these things are there, protecting yourself. So there's this phrase in Yoruba of water no get enemy, that Fela Kuti popularized in a song. But metal is a similar in the idea that no matter what you do with water, if your infant drowns in water, you still have to drink water to survive.
Mm,
If you burn yourself with hot water, you're still going to drink water to survive and use water every day. Like water does not have enemies. In a similar way, metal itself is so intrinsically tied with our advancement as a species,
mm,
that it's up there with control of fire, in order to make the metal useful as well. Um,
right.
and our harnessing of the elements in this way, that Ogunda is tied into that. They say that there's no full blessing here because you have to pay attention,
Mm,
and war requires vigilance,
mm,
and this sign is hard. So it has many manifestations, because we always modify the Odu by other Odu. Um, but I think there's more overt overlap here conceptually and feeling wise about war, destruction. I also am reminded of Cata Draconis being, as you said, Mars and Saturn, and we are entering, by the time this comes out, have entered Mars retrograde, which will
mm,
happen until February, and Mars retrograde in Leo and then in Cancer. And so Mars in Leo is already an aggressive force, but in retrograde, it's interesting because in researching, the deities of this sign, as it were, right? Because
yeah.
everybody thinks Mavers is there, Mars is there, Saturn is there, but Athena is listed actually. Um,
Hmm.
and Athena as strategy, specifically in Cata Draconis, but Athena is also incredibly, as maker of heroes, is an incredible force of manipulation in the Greek myths, right? Like this
Mm,
gray-eyed goddess is plotting and playing through everyone. And if anybody's read Circe, the more modern story, what's her name? I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember the Madeline Miller is the one who wrote it. But Athena is she's terrifying when she comes because
mm,
she's manipulating everybody. And
right.
that strategy is there. And I was just reading today about the Mars retrograde and that it can bring on an Athena like coldness and need to strategize about everything, that war is here in when Mars is in retrograde, and you must
Mm,
plot your moves and hold your words and understand that your words have a power that is perhaps weighted more during this time period. Uh,
mm,
so I thought that was an interesting overlap of Mars retrograde and Athena being brought up, and then Athena being a deity, perhaps ascribed to the sign itself. Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah. Careful strategy, right?
yeah,
Yeah. That Saturn's best when it's dispassionate.
yeah.
Mm,
Revenge best served cold. Yeah, like this is,
mhm,
that Athena as, I don't mean this in the 80s way, but Cold War
mm,
of, wisdom, strategy, whatever you want to call it, that plotting out of things is this German and then British inheritance of God of something is really difficult. When we describe the personalities of the gods itself, it's actually much more accurate, right? Like we these are
yeah,
two, and that Athena as strategic and plotting, well, fuck wisdom and fuck weaving and all that stuff. Anything that requires strategy is where she's present. Um,
yeah.
and Aries is bloodlust and violence and heat, and there's a difference. And that's, I remember being in school and trying to figure out, like, wait, these are both gods of war. What is,
Mm,
but they're very different. Uh,
mm,
even the strategy of keeping your maidenhead, as is extended, even though we know virgin means something different, but
right.
decided choices, plotting out things and being in control, and perhaps a little bit of a control freak, but I'm also an Athena fan. So,
That's a nice connection. I like that. Huh. Huh. Hmm.
yeah. Okay. So Kata, I feel good about. I can see us going to Hermit or Blood Sacrifice.
I think we should dive into some blood sacrifice.
Okay.
I
So
think so. You know,
awesome.
just to season our festivities of murdered children with something light and non-controversial. Um, I thought about the appearances of blood in grimoiric and folk magic, and I had some thoughts, especially on what we're not necessarily talking about. Um, the idea of blood in like the sense of sacrifice being about a relationality. And I thought it was helpful to start off by distinguishing the use of blood in pact-based kind of grimoires and the things we call the the shadier end of necromantia. I think it's
Mhm.
worth distinguishing pact-based blood work from feeding demons, and I don't mean that in the cool Buddhist sense. Um, so we see bloodletting before ritual as part of purification. That's not this, right? That's voiding ill humors so that you are at your best, in the same way that you would scrub your body and take your ritual bath once a year, whether you needed it or not, right? It's clearly part of purification. Now, occasionally with that bloodletting, we do see that the blood is scattered about the circle, which to my mind might well speak of attracting unclean spirits. But again, we do that so we can bind them to particular tasks. It's the cheese in the circle trap. It's not a reward or an offering. We do see plenty of use of blood from animals, birds especially for inks, but again, not so often feeding things blood as much as utilizing that blood's occult virtues. Doves, bats, poor little hopos and hupos and lapwings, right?
Yeah.
We do get pacts signed in blood, which might include drawing the sigils of some unclean spirits in blood. But to me, that looks a lot more like, again, you're pacting, you're creating a link so that the spirit can find you. This is my scent. These are my vital fluids, right? That's the point of a pact, that they come quicker, right? You're making a connection. But I guess what I'm talking around specifically is this practice of bleeding onto a sigil as an offering to a senior demon, which gives me immense pause. Um, I I can't speak to more of the witchcrafts on this as much, but in terms of like straight up grimoire demonology, I don't see it being espoused by terribly stable magicians.
Who
Yeah.
are you to judge?
The person that gets called when it goes wrong. Uh, so I guess it's
No,
job
it's
security
making you
for them,
money.
innit?
You should encourage
It's
that.
job security, right? Yeah, everyone should be bleeding on demons all the time. And here's my
That's
number
the quote I'm pulling.
and my low quote for unbewitching you. Yeah,
I'll teach you how
doctors.
to bleed on a sigil, and then I'll charge you to remove the demon.
I mean, this is a little bit what the
Cunning
Puritans
man.
are saying that cunning folk are doing, that they're in league with, that the white witches are in league with the black witches and doing a protection racket of exactly that nature. That's what kind of Gifford and Fairfax and various other people are kind of arguing in the early modern period. But any a witch doctor, like another other doctors, and maybe like radicals, is ideally working to make themselves redundant.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
I think if we have these pesky things called morals. Um,
It's such a controversial topic in so many ways, and we expanded it from animal sacrifice specifically to blood sacrifice
yeah.
because this is a larger discussion, or aiming towards a larger discussion about the properties of blood,
Mm.
I believe, and or the perceived properties of blood and how it applies towards what the nature of sacrifice is. I
Yeah.
mean, again, I brought it up earlier, but I was raised with the heavy belief of Jesus's sacrifice on the cross. It erases the need for animal sacrifice, because Hebrews chapter 9, I remember it well. However, we all still eat meat, and
Mm.
the notion of many, quote unquote, I was going to use the term barbaric because a lot of people do apply that term, and this is not to comment on various views of eating animals in general, but the Western culture is so divorced from how we process food,
Yeah.
uh, that we don't even think of the butcher necessarily as unclean anymore. It's just another person that's giving us food that we go by that is disconnected from the animal.
Yeah.
Uh, and the act of killing, like I think of the Buddhist notions of like the act of killing the animal has a karmic weight to it, but eating the meat has less karmic weight, and is not inherently bad. Like there's nothing in Buddhism that says you must be vegetarian. In fact, the Buddha was not, and lamas in Tibet cannot be because they're going to eat whatever they can, whatever they're served.
Right. It's not the land to grow vegetables in.
No, but they will eat whatever is offered and they avoid certain things and they wouldn't kill themselves for food. But
Mm.
I also, I have my own thoughts on like if you're having others kill for you, I don't understand the blood diamonds factor comes in, right?
Yeah.
Or the cell phone factor comes in about precious metals in our phones and child labor and everything it's a complexity that we always want to be considering our impact and where things go. But for people who eat meat to criticize cultures that rely on any form of animal sacrifice is a very strange thing to me. Especially,
Yeah.
I think there's this idea that there's this wanton like waste of, slit the throat and the blood goes everywhere and the animal just sits there as a rot, as opposed to like, and then it gets cleaned and processed and the people eat the meat. It's the whole thing of like the Greek myths of like the bones and the gristle and the things that the people don't want to eat are what go to, the gods. It's different than the meat that we eat. We separate things according to law, basically divisions, and this is temple priests versus the wider world, right? Like you eat. That's what you need to do.
Yeah. The flesh of these butchered animals is cooked and shared as not just nourishment for said communities, but like a blessed medicine.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of cultural arguments here. There's a lot of things that go on there. Um, Yeah. I think the notion of blood itself is fascinating because I remember there was a forum, I think it was Facebook, because I will Mandela affect everything and can't remember exactly where it was. I do think it was Facebook. We were talking about it is not uncommon in certain Mexican practices to put blood on copal or on paper and burn it.
Mm.
And it's attested to historically, but also by many practitioners who this is something that is culturally done, especially in the modern parlance where they don't use paper to do it, which is very common in pre-colonial times, like fig paper.
Mm.
And you would saturate something in blood and then burn it. But to use copal, where you would use a pricker and coat of copal so that there was a sweet smell with your blood, and that this was an offering to God, to the gods, to your ancestors, amongst other things.
Mm.
And I remember someone I respect as a priestess in many things, who was like, "This will only bring bad things and only bring demons." And was like, "I cannot hear you over an entire culture doing this to honor their ancestors." And then people
Mhm.
like, "There's no evidence of that." It was like, "All right, wait." And then it made me have to go hunt down articles because it did take a while to find what was still an extant cultural practice be represented in the academic record.
Mm.
And so what I did find was whole descriptions of and analyses of the royal families of the Maya, who, if you are of noble birth in, Chichen Itza, then you are basically a blood bag for the people. And your job was to once a day, multiple times a day, perhaps, go and bleed upon the charcoal and inhale the smell of your own blood with sweet resins to the point where you fell into trance with the ancestors and told them what had to happen. You would come back with knowledge from these visitations with the ancestors, and you see a famous relief of the vision serpent. It's if I footnote the thing, it's there, but you'd recognize it instantly if you saw it. It's a head of a man coming out of a serpent arising from a brazier.
Mm.
And this is a commonly duplicated image. So yeah, so there's some interesting things here of the bloodletting rituals. You communicate with the ancestors, the gods this way. Sometimes the blurring point between ancestor and god, right? There's a lot going on here. The idea that, again, like Quetzalcoatl offers blood, and is what births us. So this offering of blood became a thing. The Christian church in Mexico and Latin America tried to turn any blood offering into, you see why Jesus is suddenly much more bloody in Latin American Catholicism and
Mm.
stays that way. Because the blood is the life, the blood is the life. There's these arguments by what is his name? The translation, when we look at um, the notion of when you translate something into a new language, quote unquote, that you are not actually doing anything to introduce new concepts. New concepts cannot be understood in translation. They can only be understood in interpretation.
Right.
And that's a different level of
Transmission.
transmission. Thank you. And so there's this great quote from, he is the scholar. He wrote a book called Rites of Sacrifice that is fantastic. It's a book on the cult of Saint Simon that is absolutely an essential reading. But his quote is, translation makes something look like something the receiver of the translation already knows. Translation translates words into symbols that evoke a signification that is part of an already well-developed worldview. Translation does not transform words into new concept in the receiver's mind. Concepts, for the most part, must be learned through interpretation. If the receiver of a certain translation does not understand the cultural and social context from which the translation comes, then it is doubtful that merely translating words into another language will be very effective in transforming the consciousness of those who are listening to the translation. It must also be added that a change of faith does not necessarily mean a transformation of consciousness. And he's specifically talking about the Franciscans, because they, instead of the Jesuits, were put in charge of Latin America and the conversion of the indigenous. And what they did is they translated the Holy Scriptures into indigenous languages, which means they used indigenous languages names for gods that already existed.
Right.
You added to the mythology, you didn't actually replace it. And so Latin American Catholicism from the beginning was a different thing. And so this over-reliance on blood, this over-reliance on seasonal rites, you just added Jesus to it. Jesus becomes the sacrifice that is needed to answer what was the 5 unholy days when the calendars were not overlapping yet. You did that to sync them back up.
Yeah.
The Maya put that onto Passion Week, and that passion exists out of time and it culminates in a human sacrifice.
Mm.
This unknown period of time is ultimately what the author, I think Tanzioni, like proposes San Simon as a manifestation of, which also ties into Tezcatlipoca complex
Yeah.
of disorder, nighttime, trickster, of this is lack of stability, and blood, especially the blood sacrifice of Jesus, brings back order. And so this memory of the Holy Innocents, or all of the sacrifices that have ever existed, all of our ancestors, this notion in Catholicism of redemptive suffering, which is a thing that I just watched this clip of a priest who, in order to help atone for the sins of the Catholic Church for people that had been molested by priests, he said to God, please let me suffer on their behalf. And he got a brain tumor. And he took this as a sign that this was God saying, I'm going to make you suffer with this because this is what you asked for. And the church really does believe in redemptive suffering. He eventually shrunk the tumor through radiation and chemo and went to Lourdes, and the tumor was gone. But his whole point was to try and bring people back to the church. Whether or not that's successful, I mean, that's his story. And he says that, yes, people have credited him with being inspirational. But that idea of redemptive suffering through blood sacrifice or autoflagellation, things like
Right.
I saw a great Instagram post by Ed Calderon, who runs La Santa del Monje, the Santísima Muerte account. Beautiful Instagram account to follow if you're interested in Santísima Muerte or Mexican folk magic. Talking about how one of the first things to go in translating Latin American spirituality is redemptive suffering. People do not want to crawl on glass on their knees to their Santísima Muerte shrine. They do not want to whip themselves in front of Santísima Muerte the way that Mexicans do. And that part of it is like you're missing a key part of cultural context there. So what got translated is the flashy miracle saint who looks like a reaper. But when you go through a hard time in life, is your thing is like, why is my life so hard? Is like, I will use this as a lesson and I will suffer with dignity in order to get through, because this is the lesson I'm being taught. I'm not saying that that's healthy. I'm saying that that's the actual cultural context.
Right.
And it's, your mileage is going to vary through every single person. All of our families have stories of people who are penitentes in different form or suffering willingly through this. I think that blood sacrifice, bloodletting in that way is an integral part of that. I think animal sacrifice is a way of not allowing such a destructive act of taking life for granted and making sure the blood and the energy of the sacrifice are used to benefit the community. And in time, that memory goes into things like demons, of like, that's how the demon has to be honored. Sure, because it's viewed as demonic by the church. It doesn't mean that there aren't demonic forms where there are just tons of sacrifice going on where you wouldn't do certain things. Darker spirits that are protective might be given the whole body of the animal and you don't partake in any of it. Quote unquote darker. I'm using
But this also requires us to believe that people know what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
That these practices over many generations are about are people who who have an awareness of these practices, these engagements with spirits, these propitiations are doing something, right? And like again, yeah, if you've got problems with that, then we've got more fundamental issues to discuss than animal sacrifice, because conceptions about those people being wrong, and let's be clear, that's usually people of color, right, seem to be coming from a place of ignorance, if not outright bigotry.
Yeah, I again can't hear you over if you eat animals. I'm now the idea that most plants are sentient on some form, not
Yeah.
sapient, but sentient, of becomes this thing of like we're all destructive entities. How can you cause less suffering? Or maybe that's a personal choice, but the judgment over others is one of those things of like, I I judge you for judging.
Right.
Which is
Especially doing so over the screams of all that battery farming.
yeah.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, there's so much I for me the complexities of like cultural memory of auto sacrifice is such an easy thing to talk about there. Um,
Yeah, and especially when we're getting into ancestors, ancestral practices, ancestral powers, guides, deities, whatever. Like the question, I think, is less about who does your blood belong to, so much as who do you owe your blood to, and what's the sense of your engagement with community as being, what are your responsibilities to it? What are your duties to it? What are your gratitudes? What are your ways of celebrating that? And of forging the hard coin of wisdom from suffering. It not being the only way to do it, but like, yeah, there being a sense of community is forged by things that are inconvenient to the individual sometimes.
I also am reminded of the oh God, I think I've quoted it before, but the whatever the myth is now, and I'll combine all these actors into one, but where someone was kind of torturing themselves through method acting, and one of the older actors was just like, "You should try acting; it's easier."
Right.
Practice in the closet for whatever day, number of days. Maybe it was Taxi Driver, maybe it was something else.
Yeah.
But the notion of like there are other ways around this, like certainly the notion of loving every living creature is where does that start and why is that important? Like that's a whole other discussion. And I'm not trying to cast doubt on that. I love the idea that we might be able to treat every creature as our mother. What do you do when someone's going to war against you? Are you going to stand by and let them kill you and your family? You might, in that nonviolent way. You might also take up arms. The question of watching a llama get asked, what do you do when you have mice in your restaurant? And how do you do it? Like if you have to kill the mice to make your family live, then you have to kill the mice. But killing the mice as little as possible, maybe you can trap them and put them somewhere else, but you get to decide, you have to decide what the balance is for the benefit of your family.
Mm.
And that, in addition to um, animal life, that human life itself is also sacred. I have mixed feelings on speciesism. I do think that there's opportunities as a human that we don't have as other species, but I also don't like it as a vertical orientation that we're somehow better. Uh,
Right, right. Right,
and
because that crown of creation, not to engage in a conservative form of argument in of itself, but can be a slippery slope,
yes,
right? Like, because who are the people then? And who are the people who aren't quite people and really should be doing the things that we don't want to do and should be denied certain rights and responsibilities. And then we're into empire again.
yeah. You
Hmm.
can't say I'm manlier. You're manlier than me and not a dog.
Hmm. Oh,
Uh,
no one needs more gender affirming works than certain cishet males, right?
yeah, hair plugs and
Hmm.
anything, any number of things. But yeah, that's ugh. Anyway. If you don't know our politics, we're hinting at them very strongly. Mm, So all of that makes me feel like I think that this is a topic we can revisit in various ways and continue throughout how
Yeah.
we do things. The focus I appreciate the nod towards like talking about blood is something different than just wanton killing.
Yeah.
The use of blood, the crying out for, that blood as especially in certain worldviews, right, as being manifested in different forms. The human blood or red blood is one form of energy that can be used and harnessed, and it has a very specific like strange to say this, but calcifying magnetic property
Hmm.
as a fluid condenser, let's say, borrowing from Barton.
Mm.
And in addition to that, like we have the sacrifice of soldiers and defenders, that are led by this kind of cauda type of way, that supposedly that sacrifice of blood of people is what makes us safe, in the way that the holy innocents blood makes is for Jesus to be
Right.
alive. There's some interesting side of, like, it's making sense of death, it's making sense of killing, is really where that sacrifice, quote unquote, to be made whole comes in, right? That spilling blood creates a debt, and you want to figure out how to rectify that debt in some way
Yeah.
and absolve yourself of the debt as quickly and as strongly as possible.
Right.
The executioner's mask, the people who, there's however many guns and one has a bullet and six are blanks, and you don't know who actually killed the person in execution.
Mm.
Type of things are all forms of sacrifice in that way. There are people that have argued horrible things about the just what it takes for progress and civilization to happen on the blood sacrifice of slave labor, indentured labor, genocide, and other things. So is that all forms of blood sacrifice? It
Mm.
sure as hell seems like it's being just not worded like that, but it ends up being that. And going for the Mesoamerican thing of, like, we don't, I'm speaking first person all of a sudden, that we understand that shifted in that way. We understand that there was less killing for sake of having specific blood sacrifice.
Ah.
Not extolling its virtues, but just pointing that out, that that's a very different thing. And the idea of I remember watching a documentary on Samaritans, and how, like, Samaritans aren't just, a group in the Bible that doesn't exist anymore. They still exist. They actually believe in a different holy mount, but they have a lot of the same codified rules as Judaism, and they still observe blood sacrifice. So it's the because
Mm.
they don't have the same temple and temple loss. So it's a very different thing. Or what is it when a village comes together and kills a bunch of animals in a halal way for a festival, and you get that blood flow? That's a huge sacrifice. Blood is something very specific. Um, hiding the blood or cleaning it up, or what is it, all those things, there's a lot to talk about there. It's extremely politicized. People have very strong feelings about it. I guess the thing about it all is that to analyze for us, it's an opportunity to analyze our own hints at what taboo is, and to perhaps not judge others so quickly on their notions of what is acceptable, without actually looking into it for longer, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. To ask, like, what blood engine are we feeding? What blood engine am I feeding or defending or ignoring? Right. This is going on in a variety of ways. And so where do we consider our actions and inactions? And what is that blood engine doing?
Yeah.
Hmm.
So blood engine, I guess, in that way, it would be easy to go into hermit maybe, but I feel like we should visit Fennel and be like, I don't know how to make a bridge to Fennel yet. Um,
Hmm. I
but
heard an account that the inside of fennel, which you can dry to be a little hollow, right, is is
uh,
is said by at least one traditional witchcraft writer to have potentially been the vessel by which Prometheus stole fire from the gods. So
ah,
the idea of the internal fire, the
and
fire that was
then
hidden,
yeah,
and connecting Prometheus even further to Lucifer as light bringer as well as fire bringer, fire stealer. Um,
I love it.
yeah, why not?
Why not?
Why not? Why? No?
Why not? It is actually, yes, more used for absinthe. Um,
You do have some wine stuff, because again, everything's boiled in wine at some point in the early modern herbal stuff I've seen. It's also, as a we're talking about fires and things. the hot liquids and the humors. Culpepper says it consumes the phlegmatic humor. He says which is obviously in fish most plentifully and annoys the body with. He puts it as primarily a herb of Mercury and especially under Virgo, and then even uses that to say, as such, it is especially antipathetic to Pisces and Piscean things and phlegmatic things. His thing about wine, where was that? Oh, yeah, that the seed is boiled in wine and drank, and that is good for those who are bitten with serpents or have eaten poisonous herbs or mushrooms. And William Langham in his Garden of
Find
Health.
poisonous mushrooms.
Well, the ones you can eat, the ones you can't eat more than once. To mangle a Pratchett quote, right? Yeah, and you see various other applications, stamping the root with honey for the bitings of mad dogs or the bitings or stingings of serpents, that kind of thing. A bunch of other stuff. There's another serpent connection actually that Langham points out where he says serpents chew it to clear their eyes,
Mhm.
interestingly. So some like mercurial stuff about clarity as well as the wisdom of serpents as well. And again, this idea of a lot of um, a lot of herb lore being either mythically or empirically derived from animal behavior is fascinating there. Langham also says to keep a horse from all diseases, you give him a good store of fennel baked in his bread and let him eat it for 3 days, each day a loaf. It is said to provoketh men to generation of children. So there's a little new children as well as children entering the world as well as children exiting the world. It's also drunk in the seeds of fennel and anise and cumin,
Come
seethed
in.
in, yeah, cumin, seethed in wine to avoid wind in the belly.
Come
And
in.
also,
Yeah.
in terms of fighting the vapors, it's also primarily used to sweeten the breath as well,
Nice.
such as, again, Langham says, yeah.
It is a Hesiod theogony where Prometheus steals fire in a hollow fennel stalk.
Oh, great.
I used to be very obsessed that the Greek word was marathon, uh,
Hmm.
marathos, and so this is the Battle of Marathon was just it's a big field of fennel.
Hmm.
And in addition, the Battle of Marathon was like that's the first marathon run of someone gets there. He died right after,
Yes.
but delivering his message. But also very importantly, part of the nine herbs charm. Uh,
Oh, of course. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
so it is in there with the nine wart spell. Um, something. Oh, Longfellow, which lovingly in the wiki lists. I like when poems come in,
Hmm.
right? Of above the lower plants it towers, the fennel with its yellow flowers, and in an earlier age than ours was gifted with the wondrous powers lost vision to restore.
Hmm.
So strengthening eyesight.
Hmm.
And so fennel is interesting because you get fennel and rue being associated heavily with Saint Lucy folklore, and Lucy being the saint of eyesight and sight of
Hmm.
other natures, where rue is what casts away phantasm and fennel brings strength to the eyes. So,
Hmm.
in addition to the other things that other various herbs you could give to promote eyesight, that there is a use here in tandem with the saints and deities of eyesight. Yeah, there's something to that.
Right. Even in terms of its combination with Rue to keep away phantasms, the notion of like ill vapors and miasmas and things like that is explicitly linked to those like anti-flatulence uses as well, right?
Yes.
The bad winds that come out of the body as well as the ones that go into it,
Yeah.
and the sweetened breath as well, the other airs that leave the body.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Yes. I know it's naturalized. I mean, it is a non-North American herb, and it is completely naturalized here. Especially on the West Coast, you can find it. And that's when I was, a burgeoning young herbalist, was surprised to constantly find it.
Hmm.
Um, it likes chaparral the chaparral of California and otherwise. And there's certain islands off the coast that are completely covered in fennel.
Mm.
So and it's interesting, right? Because the greens have a slightly this really intoxicating smell, but it's a very different smell than the root. Uh,
Yeah.
and which is not uncommon, but it's still this that slight licoricey smell,
Yeah.
sweetened by the leaves in whatever form that they are. Um, yeah.
And like licorice has some of those appetite suppressant qualities as well, right?
Yes,
It's used for sometimes.
use as an aromatic and often like put into sausages and things like that. Anything to hide the smell of rotting meat, which is often what sausages were.
Hmm.
Meat that was starting to turn, so you add strong things in like sage and fennel.
Yeah.
Um, whether it goes spicy or sweetened. Um, yeah.
Right. And that have been shown by some herbalists to actually like fight off some of the bacterial stuff that can grow from those bad things as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting that it's so associated with the Mediterranean as far as cuisine, although it is used around the world. It's just that,
Mm,
you know, if you're used to having roast fennel, then it's, there'll be, are you Italian? Are you
mm,
Spanish? What's going on here? Uh,
hmm. And the wider use in those kinds of cultures of what's what's considered a sweetener, right? Those anise cookies of Italian American fame, right? Rather than having too much sugar in them. So that kind of I don't know, there's something a little mercurial about that. If it's with a sweet thing, then it can be sweet with the sweet and bitter with the bitter.
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, just even the classification, the difference between just humoral classification of herbs, but also sweet and bitter is a common taste classification
Mm,
and is used especially heavily in like Latin American herbalism of sweet plants versus bitter plants. And things like fennel would be notoriously sweet. Um, Even though is it about the sugar? No, there's some the action of it too is an attraction. It is a drawing. It's a strengthening rather than a repelling
mm,
like rue, which would be a bitter herb, quite literally a bitter herb. Uh,
right.
Usually you use one after the other in many things, but damned be that when it comes to the St. Lucie formula.
Mm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, fennel was a lot easier than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, it kind of is what it is, right? Like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And that transferring of fire, that consumption of the phlegmatic, the combination with honey for sweetness for against poisoning. Yeah, yeah. A fairly clear profile.
Yeah, certainly.
Good clarity.
Hmm. Well,
So,
that makes us a little bit of hermit, which I think we can just dip our toes into because the true queen of the clothes is Erictho.
of course, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about the Hermit in terms of the move from the older depictions as time or the old man or even the hunchback in some cases, Il Gobbo, um, and that originally the lantern as an hourglass, and this is very much embodiment of Father Time or Old Man Time, which is occurring in Italian culture from at least the 1440s, especially as part of that whole kind of notion of the several ages of life, right? Four of them, or seven of them, or even 10, depending on which sources we're looking at. And that these get linked to the planets. And so old age is where we get slow and where our bones become more of a concern. And, again, the privilege of becoming elderly is a very saturnine thing.
I see you
And
can bridge blood sacrifice by hermetizing yourself up like Ursabet Bathory and then
mhm.
bathing in the blood of virgins to keep your skin young.
Exactly, yeah. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. The use of young people's blood is turns up in all sorts of humoral stuff. It's mostly like the ancients used to do this by the early modern period, but sometimes, yeah, they are like if you can get a young person who has too much blood, who is too sanguine, it's healthy for them, and it's also healthy for old people to consume that.
Really, the doctors are just selling young people blood to the old people and saying this young person needs a letting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It does have some unfortunate like side effects of it turning into a very dystopian cyberpunk novel, right? Uh, yeah, yeah. But
Or worse
there's
thing.
well, yeah. I mean,
I mean,
interesting
it depends on
times.
which side of it you're on, right?
Hmm. Interesting times. Yeah. So it's that melancholy of old age and of Father Time and of Saturn and things of the hermit that starts to bring in other qualities that seem to shift this notion of the old man to who doesn't have an explicit religious context yet in the earlier stuff, but as a patron of the melancholic, that definitely includes scholars and monks, and especially those whose lifestyle requires like solitude, right? So um, by the 1650s in the Tarot de Marseille, we still have an old man, grey beard, walking stick, but a lantern now. And that's where we start to get associations again more formally of silence, celibacy, austerity, solitude, contemplation, absence of passion.
The
Um,
Diogenes factor, yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, searching for an honest man. Also links to the cardinal virtues, which you've talked about a little bit before in the tarot deck, right? Strength, justice, and temperance being literally in there, and then the search for the fourth of prudence. And for many people, say for instance the Charles VI deck, where prudence is the world card, but for at least for French occultists. Um, by Marseille onwards, it's the hermit who's that fourth virtue, the ability to distinguish good from bad, to learn from the past, to make wise choices in the present, to plan for the future properly, um, foresight based in hindsight, all that kind of stuff. And so here, the hermit's lantern starts to become talked about as the illumination of the mind that lights the past and the future and the present. And that again is referring back to the allegory of time. Um, but then we get the start of not just being alone, but or wandering off from something or withdrawal, but of a certain sense, not so much of mastery as being on the mountain and maybe even coming down, and the lighthousing of it. And it's here it seems that we get old Arthur Waite coming in and disagreeing with all the French occultists and saying that the hermit isn't about protecting yourself, isn't about like shrouding some of the light with your cloak, isn't about isolation or withholding yourself from the world, but is about and isn't it seems he's saying not really even about like this quest for wisdom, but that the hermit represents already having completed this kind of quest and becoming a way shower, that the best thing you can do when you've attained enlightenment is to help other people attain enlightenment to some degree, as a wise guide. And so the lantern
So
becomes
the
a
hermit is coming out of seclusion to teach people. Like it's a
yeah,
strange.
yeah. And so we got this idea about the card. Is the card challenging you to embody the hermit, right? Have you acquired the life experiences that you are useful for you to be a mentor to others, right? And if not, then maybe yeah, you do need to like withdraw a little bit and work on your stuff and develop your ideas and find your mountaintop to meditate on, but that that the hermit's path can lead out of solitude and back into the worldly affairs to inspire others, right? So not just a sloughing off of this world of sighs and horrors and meat and gas and corpses, but that you are yourself doing. Yeah, I just like the idea of like the best thing you can do if you think you're enlightened is not to wander around telling everyone you're enlightened or even sit smugly under your waterfall, but to actually like help others to do what they're doing.
So, there's a famous St. Francis quote of that of preach the gospel at all times when necessary, use words. Uh,
Right. Always be transmitting.
yeah, whether you are whether you want to or not, so you might as well acknowledge it. Um,
Right. And yeah, also that thing about like it's not a rank to achieve or an accolade to praise yourself with. It's the work ahead, right? For anyone who's decided they're gonna try and teach something or help other people, it's not it can be a like, hey, take some time for yourself, but it can also be a like, remember what you're doing this for.
yeah, I know it's one of the markers that many readers will use as this person needs therapy and you need to recommend it to them.
Right. Another guide, right? Another light by which to see the dark that you don't want to look at yourself.
Yeah, and I like it when it's phrased like, don't turn counsel down in any form right now. Like, you're
Ah,
someone who needs medical counsel, therapeutic counsel, spiritual counsel, because you're trying to base because you don't want them to pass it off and be like, well, you're spiritually giving me therapy right now. Like, no, 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 that's not what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Professional help. You need a hermit to talk to.
Yeah.
In relationships specifically, it can deal with emotional intimacy and a need to kind of pare back from distraction and focus on each other again.
Mm.
It,
Right, right, right. Not separating, but give it quality time.
and the other side of it in money is that it's often there's too much spending going on. You need to be prudent and things
Mm.
like that. So cultivating an awareness of non-material things,
Mm.
which is, money's tight. Be like the hermit. Um,
Right,
and then,
right.
health-wise is exactly what you talked about. It always ends up being like a spiritual connection to it, of embracing and cultivating a deeper understanding of who we are and who we want to be
Yeah.
in that way. Um, it can also just be a lonely card, when it's reversed and things like that for a lot of
Yeah.
people, or that you're desperately seeking someone when it's in its reversal place, which is a really difficult card for some people to confront. And they
Yeah.
signify the need to edit, as you were saying, to kind of take on more bite-sized things rather than trying to focus on the huge overwhelming goal when reversed. So
Yeah. One step in front of the other up the mountain,
yeah,
and
or even
especially back down again.
yeah, that's the famous quote, right? That more people die coming down the mountain than going up,
Yeah.
because you think you did it. Yeah, awesome. Well, lovely.
Well, does
And
that lay the way for our specialist guest?
well, I mean, if you're going to talk about a form of a hermit, that, like
Uh-huh.
the living in hmm, the othering, right? So the hermit is still othered.
Mm.
You live alone. You've retreated from society. There's something else going on there. But Erictho, the I want to say in the loveliest way, or let me put it this way: the tulpa evolving into an egregoric manifestation out of Ovid's writings.
Mm.
It's such a strong character that it feels like it's interesting that Erictho gets pulled as fiction, whereas Circe and Medea get pulled as mythology.
Mm. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's a really interesting. So like the legends of the witches of Thessaly, yes, come in, but like it's Thessaly is witchcraft land, and
Right.
it is what it is. That it witches, drugs, poisons, everything by the Roman
Hmm.
time, and that you know it's yes, Ovid is there, but Lucan is the one who we associate most heavily with Erictho and Pharsalia.
Right. And giving her a big hag energy.
Yeah, huh, she is witch archetype in a way that you do not see. Circe and Medea are sorceress.
Hmm.
Rick, though, comes in as full hag upon hags, like semi-divine, semi-demonic, whatever we want to call that from the
Mm.
beginning, because this is she is a necromancer, right? She's looking at bodies in the field, and if she tried to raise up the entire army on the field to return to war, the laws of Erebus would have been yielded, and a host pulled from the Stygian Avernus by her terrible power would have
Mm.
gone to war. Uh,
Mm.
so, Pompey, the great son, is seeks her out and
Mm.
wants to know the outcome of the battle of Pharsalus. And she complies and wanders amidst the bodies, amidst the mists, to seek out a specific body with uninjured tissues of a stiffened lung. And
Mm.
she cleans the corpse. She fills the body with a potion consisting of, amongst other things, warm blood, lunar poison, and everything that nature wickedly bears, and
Mm.
brings the body back to life. The spirit is summoned, but it first refuses to return to its old body. She then threatens the entire universe by promising to summon that god at whose dread name Earth trembles. After this, the corpse is reanimated and offers a bleak description of a civil war in the underworld, as well as a rather strange, like, prophecy for Pompey. Uh,
Hmm.
so
Yeah.
it's very Witch of Endor, like moving forward, right? There's something going on here.
Yeah, yeah. She's being asked to help a particular political ends, and they're resorting to someone who is very good at what they do, but what they're very good at seems to be a bad thing.
Yeah. She
Hmm.
eats the dead, so she has a ghoulish nature where
Oh yeah, yeah. She's all
she
sorts of fun, right? It's
is
not just her
eating the
job.
fingernails and the eyes and pulling them out. She lives near the gibbets and graveyards. It is gibbets, right? Am I crazy?
I believe
And not
so, yeah.
gibbet. Yeah, I can't remember if it's gibbets or gibbets, but I'm pretty sure it's gibbets.
Hmm.
Um, the crow's cages, things that you see in
Right.
lovely. You're stuck here. Battlefields and stuff. So she's wandering. She's doing everything the taboos that we don't want to engage in, but
Hmm.
she is tied into a larger analysis of Sibyl lore, where the Sibyls are prophesying in good ways, and the Sibyls are ordered and have their weird habits, but you know where to go find them as a
And yeah, and they're pious, right?
yeah.
Whereas she's like scornful of Orthodox religion, right?
Yeah. Oh,
Never beseeches the gods, nor does call the divine with a suppliant hymn, right? Yeah, she's the inverse of these like good prophetesses. Yeah, 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 yeah. Some little bits of things that do look a bit like um the actual invention of the witch, right, in the late medieval, early modern, especially around her breath poisoning otherwise non-lethal air. And again, that she's not just doing this as like these aren't just spell components. These are clearly like passion projects, right? She's
uh,
eagerly doing this stuff. She's like delighting in this. Um, yeah, 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 yeah. Oh God, where's this quote from uh, uh, W.R. Johnson's Momentary Monsters
uh,
on Lucan and his heroes, where he says, where they say, she shows an inexhaustible fullness of life and an unwearying zest for maliciousness and purposeless activity, something fairly rare outside of, say, the dark farces of Ben Jonson. A living caricature of wickedness, a pure distillation of frenetic immorality.
that's
Um, yeah, 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 yeah. David Auerbach, in his essay on Erictho, the witch, the necromancer, has these 2 points that he kind of reiterates, which is that, like, firstly, Erictho doesn't really have a particular ulterior motive. He says she's more just an animistic force, much like
yeah.
the universe, right? She's not like trying to trick anyone or has a particular stake in things. She just loves mucking about with her corpses, right?
Yeah.
And
She's pure repulsion to the standard mind, right?
Yeah,
There's no peace. She's not burying the dead. She's a necromantic creature herself.
yeah.
She's not of this world and extremely powerful and scares everybody because of this engagement with taboo.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Albach makes that point about like how where other seers and Pythia claim to have this knowledge and power but can't actually make good on it. Eric, though, he says, occupies a place above the gods and even above Caesar, blithely in control of the forces of the universe.
Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
I love the discussion. There's a lot of academic papers written about this of Virgil in Dante's Inferno.
Oh yeah, they don't like it, do they? A lot of
No,
them.
well, because it's nice. It's our sweet spot, right? Of necromancy includes demonology
Hmm.
because or demonomancy because of the notion that the dead are in their graves until the second coming, and there is no contact with the dead except saints, and therefore for a Christian to write in the Inferno in I think it's Canto number 9 that Virgil says he traveled to the depths of hell in order to get a soul for one of Erichtho's necromantic rites. And this means that somebody was actually talking to the dead.
Mm.
And this causes problems because that is not at line with Christian, you know, Orthodox catechism. Um,
Right, right, right. But it makes so much more sense when we're thinking about, nigromantic hagiographic blur and all those kinds of things,
yes.
right? It makes little sense for the history, and I do have some time for those scholars that have pointed out that like connecting Virgil to Erictho, um, like that Virgil, that Lucan is in the Pharsalia, writes the Pharsalia, is born around 50 years after the death of Virgil. So like, okay, yeah, all right, it doesn't necessarily make sense in that sense of history, but in terms of the hagiography of Virgil, absolutely popular medieval beliefs that he's a magician and prophet.
Yeah.
Does all sorts of stuff. with the dead and whatnot. Yeah. Love it.
Yeah, you have the other side of it being a contrivance, a hermeneutic contrivance, right? Which is meant to cast doubt about Virgil himself. And it becomes this thing of like this feels really reaching. Based on the evidence of what you just said, that Virgil
Yeah,
is a magician, Virgil is psychopomp, like
yeah,
Virgil is Hermes here. Let's calm the fuck down.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and that there's this side of it, right? That it also, I do think that there's something to it of talking about Lucan, she's so outside the natural order and not
Mm,
beholden to the gods, but by Virgil having to go into hell and get the soul for her, that she is now back into the Christian control.
yeah,
It has to go through the standard. Even Virgil, great pagan is having to do something that through the Christian hell in order to help her work.
right, right. So she is kind of, yeah, what's the word? Recuperated.
Yeah,
Hmm. Yeah. And yet, is still they're still drawing on all these ideas of her just loving doing what she's doing. And uh I love this bit in Pharsalia about she's like moaning about people being squeamish about the underworld. She's like, if indeed I show you the swamps of Styx and the shore that roars with fire, if by my aid you're able to see the Eumenides and Cerberus shaking his necks that bristle with snakes and the conquered backs of giants, why should you be scared, you cowards, to meet with ghosts who are themselves afraid? Yeah. I got yeah. I see the truth of it. I see the attraction.
yeah,
So one
yeah,
of the other kind of little controversies that I know is a sweet spot for you is reading Alberto Montana Frutos's stuff on pointing out the potential difficulties of talking about ancient witchcraft, right? Because as opposed to sorcery or necromancy, we don't get the figure of the witch identified as a real person until the political invention of the crime of
yes,
witch, right? That we get bad spirits or mythological or mythic figures. But it says, the incarnated witch was in the beginning the embodiment of traditional beliefs, but in the 15th century she was adopted and adapted by these ecclesiastical writers in the form of the theological witch. And actually points out that like as much as we can clearly see that she's a witch's witch, right? That she
yes,
doesn't have a lot of the main traits associated with that traditional version, that archetypal character. She doesn't fly or transform herself into a nocturnal bird. She doesn't suck blood. She doesn't cast the evil eye exactly. She doesn't exactly produce nightmares. And she doesn't exactly have innate powers exercise except by resort to her enchantments. But she has a masterful take on those things, right? Um, and the links of like also separating her from Lamia as well as Strix or Striga. That like this is on the one hand, absolutely, this is coming to occupy a witch power, but we need to bear in mind like what it means to say that, let alone ideas around how apt it is even to talk about witchcraft outside of late medieval, early modern European contexts, right? Like
yeah.
when are we translating and when are we transposing? When are we um, uh, confining more and not really learning about other approaches, other cosmologies, other cultures, other people's engagement with grim but necessary work? And when are we giving a fullness to those things and finding a dark umbrella by which all black magics will agree in the dark?
Yeah, there's some beautiful things there of, understanding the witch archetype as out the threat of it is that it is outside order.
Mm,
And that is not where we go when it becomes humans, right?
mm.
And this notion of like the Lamassu, the beast, Lamashtu, that's the demoness.
I think so, yeah.
So the notion of as a possible origin of like Lilith-like entities, right? That Lamashtu is so outside the order of the gods that is why she is a threat, and that is why they use Pazuzu to control her.
Right.
That you use an evil to combat the evil you don't understand. So
Hmm.
that it's uh chaotic evil. It's not truly evil. It's chaotic amoral. And it just it unlawful. Is that unlawful? Is that what it is? It's
Yeah, a chaotic evil rather than a lawful evil.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that threat to it is that it threatens both the gods fighting on both sides of the war, which reminds me of the lovely phrase in Mesoamerican mythology of Tezcatlipoca being the enemy on both sides. That
Mm,
there's not you can't side with Tezcatlipoca. He will always be the enemy.
mm,
And that is it's a wonderful like twisted strategy to the devil complex, right? That like you can't outsmart the devil here in that way. And Erictho is outside the order of things. And I
mm,
think that that's why it's so fascinating to see, yes, that lust, but that lust is like it's this is the hag in full form of just living amongst the dead and the juices and the grossness, and her appearance is horrifying. But she's even talked about like she's a gorgon, but she's not a gorgon. She doesn't have snakes in her hair.
mm.
She's just horrific of appearance and smell. She uses, she's a Bene Gesserit and uses the voice, uh, really influence people. She's in Goethe's Faust, right? In Walpurgisnacht. She's the first one to speak. Um,
Yeah, and that's a really interesting appearance because like this outside of the social order means she gets to have this take on what's going on. That's really fascinating, right? Because they're kind of winding back to that battle, right? It's a deliberate reframing of the stuff in Pharsalia, right? Um, and for a start, like there's some stuff about rectifying just how bad she is a little bit without saying she's actually an angel or anything, right? Where's the line? To this night's awful festival, as oft before, I stride in view, Erictho, I, the gloomy one, not so atrocious as the tiresome poet crew calumniate me to excess. Right? So there's that start of like, I got some stuff to say that isn't that's it's the classic like don't believe the poets about me kind of thing.
yeah.
But what I'm fascinated by in that initial speech is how these are meditation, how she meditates on violence and tyranny and war, like again from this outside view, again from this place of what Johnson says about how for her doing bad things to good people or even to bad people or to anyone at all for vice and virtue do not enter her imagination is fun, right? In all of that take, and it's not saying she isn't doing that, but the stuff that she gets back to is like how people are awful to each other, right? Uh, for each one who knows not how to rule his inborn self is all too fain to rule his neighbor's will, as prompts his own proud mind. Here was a great example fought even to the end about this war. How violence opposes greater violence, how freedom's lovely thousand blossomed wreath is rent, and the stiff laurel bends around the ruler's head.
Mhm.
Ah, love it.
And the
Yeah.
world knows now who won. She's like, I told you.
I fucking told you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I was right, bitches. Um,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
just that what is the that last part of becoming is it not for me that I approach the living, doing harm to them? That brings me evil fame and benefits me not. Already it sinks down discreetly, I withdraw. These weird soliloquies that come up,
Hmm.
right? Of like Hecate's speech that was probably inserted in the Witches of Macbeth. Um,
Mm.
it's interesting these long things of like let's just set the scene, but also when you're setting a scene and you have this start, people have to adjust to where they are. So they hear Erictho set the scene of Walpurgisnacht.
Yeah.
She does not do anything after that point, right?
Yeah.
She is merely, I am witch, hear me roar. We are amongst witches on May's Eve.
Hmm.
I now withdraw. So it serves the theatrical device of you need to listen. I'm going to mention witchcraft enough times here and how who I am so that you know we are now in a different time area. Because then the lines become very quick, right? We go into the homunculus and Mephistopheles just talking back and forth.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so it's a different thing, a different tone. It is the scenery is painted by Erictho's words, and
Mm.
then she does leave. Um,
Right.
but I love, there's this. It is a meme. It is a lifestyle choice. It's many things. but the whole thing of like everybody wants to do witchcraft until it's time to do witchcraft things, or
Mm.
everybody wants to do XYZ until it's time to do XYZ things.
Mhm.
And, there's this type where we have taken everything to metaphor, and that is poetry. And I love poetry, but it can also teach us to talk about things that we don't know anything about. Like all books, thank you, Rabelais. But uh, there's also this if witchcraft is just paganism, then why are witches in ancient pagan religions as well?
Yeah.
Like this notion of the other, the one that is outside the bonds of order, who does not care that these quote unquote witchet deities, which are always considered amoral and very difficult to harness, you can not work with them, you can propitiate them, and maybe they will help you, but their goal is not actually to help you.
Right.
And if we go past this stereotype and into the ladies who make pacts with the forest lords in various African mythologies, or similarly across Europe, right, of like riding with the Diana and joining the wild hunt of Herodias and all these things that happen. These are not You can't reason with these witches. They will do what they as a group decide is happening at the whim of their leader, at the whim of the seasons, at the whim of a whim.
Mm.
And can turn about and change course. I think the that parallel that has been proposed many times, that witch hunts always came stronger after little mini ice ages, because there were no crops that were good for a few couple years, and you got to blame somebody. Um,
Right.
and there's a lot going on. So yes, Erictho, putting the witch back in witchcraft, absolutely. Doesn't mean I want to spend a whole afternoon with her, but I sure would love to smell her once. Uh, Maybe braid her chin hairs and put a few beads on them or something.
Mhm.
Um, that is, it's that it's. I was just discussing with someone who's trained, very knowledgeable in Hinduism. We're talking about that notion of Western obsession with agori, and the notion of like, can a Western actually engage in the taboo of eating half-finished food and drinking alcohol and eating meat? It's not the same thing in any shape or form. Which the Chaotes suggested, if you'll remember correctly, was that everybody should play with shit because that's the only thing that left that's taboo in Western culture.
Right.
That Jesus was a scat man. Um, and Jesus shed for your skins. Anyway, or I think that was the funeral knell of my, that was my canceled right there. One can only hope. And then I can shed my form and become the Erictho that I want to be. Um,
Free.
yeah. So okay, I know it's a short tribute, but I mean, fucking Erictho, like
Mm.
she's lovely. And I know that it's more than many times used as a literary device than perhaps memory of an actual figure or goddess or legend or things in this way. Whereas Kirke, Circe, and Medea both have these things of this feels like remnants of a larger mythology as well that's being
Mm.
brought in. And especially Medea being married to a hero, or partnered to a hero, and that type of thing of like this feels like local sorcery, sorceress goddess figure
Yeah.
that now worked into the mythology through contact and contagion. And that's how things work. Erictho certainly feels more like literary device. She does, but she's one damn good one. Uh,
Right. I was surprised to not find her as present in, maybe I'm just not looking in the right places in pop culture, but like I couldn't find a lot of reference to her as like cropping up in movies or fiction or things like that, or
no,
even in like contemporary practice as much.
yeah. I mean, you see her in, plays, operas, like briefly.
Mm.
It's not, she is witch, she's important. She's in the Inferno, but it's still, she doesn't help. It's better to focus on, I think, just the everyday woman being the Erictho is not your neighbor. She's so
Mm.
beyond your neighbor. It's so much better to have your neighbor be the villain, uh,
Yeah.
of the woman who's stealing your butter. Um,
Hmm. Right.
yeah,
Right. Mm.
I suspect anyway.
Hmm.
So, okay, I guess with that, have we indeed covered everything? I think we have.
We have discussed Holy Innocents' Day. We have discussed Paimon. We have discussed fennel. We have discussed lead. We have discussed the camel. We have discussed the wind of Hecatl, which I'll say right one day. I'll pronounce that TL right one day.
That's
We've
very close. It is.
I'm getting there. We have blood. We've discussed blood sacrifice. We've discussed Cauda Draconis and its counterparted Ogunda. We've discussed the Hermit, and we have given some, I think, well-deserved and perhaps overdue praise for Erictho. Yeah, that's our those are our Sesame Street topics. Thank you, dear listener, for joining us on this lovely co-ramble.
Yes.
Hope you
Um, as always, and or as never. We're hoping that this will herald in some new things. But with this episode, this is the first time we have recorded an episode every month for a solid year. So I just want to say thank you, Al, for making the time. It's always a pleasure. We've
likewise.
seen each other far more than this, but
Mhm.
we're not always in a position where we're like, okay, we should record an episode. But it's thank you for agreeing that we should make it a priority and see what it's like. And it was lovely, and I hope that we keep going with it. And rumor has it that we will be gearing towards a Patreon of some sort, where if you feel like getting more rambles and more behind the scenesy, researchy, and as well as practical use of this material, like in various proposed and historical magics,
Yeah.
and the invocation of said spirits and things like this. Join us there. We're excited to see where it goes. Al and I both are diviners and make hopefully Al makes more things than I do right now, but I would love to rejoin that world of making things. But my hands are still glued together. But providing first looks at projects that we're both working on,
Yeah.
in and out of the artistic sense and also on the scholastic sense. And please do feel free to join us there, look at us there. Also check out Dr. Al's amazing Patreon for if you are interested, as I assume you are if you have listened to this multiple hour podcast, that you are interested in necromancy and cunning craft and geomancy, that his Patreon is a wealth of knowledge, as is he. And I would dare say you're pretty damn generous with your thought processes, your sources, and your excitement about the fields that you study. And it's always a pleasure to chat with you. And yeah, a little end of the year thank yous and appreciation and gratitude. So
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I feel very much the same way. I know you've got, all sorts of exciting things that you get to do and all sorts of ways in which you support your community in so many ways, that I'm really grateful for all the time we get to spend. And yeah, especially, yeah, getting the full 12 in a year has been great. Excited to have more sustainable ways to do more of that. And exactly, yeah, to get into more practical things we can do with these featured herbs and minerals and beasts and magics and things. Yeah, really excited for this next step of things. And yeah, really, really grateful to be on the road with you.
absolutely. So, radiofreegolgotha.com, Speakeasy of the Dead, which will have not happened on the day that this comes out, but will shortly forthwith happen.
I believe if this does indeed come out if we are speaking to you from the past, on the 28th, I believe
If we
we're doing.
could have perfected this so that it goes and comes out, yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Indeed, tomorrow, the 29th, there is another speakeasy. No,
That's
the
right.
29th or 30th?
No, the 29th, the Sunday. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Uh,
Hmm.
fake math works in my head.
Speakeasy of the Dead, end times for the end of the
Yes.
year. Excited to talk about Enochiana's Apocalypse Engine, about Mesoamerican endings and new beginnings. We've got Dr. Jen joining us to talk about astrologies. and all the wonderful things that we're going to get to hear her expound upon so wonderfully, and a range of other guests and pals doing little turns and sections on Plants of the Dead, Dead Weather Report, all that good stuff that our online cabaret for fancy necromancers allows us to do, with a small door tax for the digital Zoom room of the cabaret being donated to charity.
Yes. So stick close to the people you are inspired by, and gather around the hearth your loved ones, because who knows where the year's going, but and especially the new year, but it's a pleasure to be in your company, Al. And yes, I'm just gonna stop there. I don't know how. Do I want to make a large poetic script of? I mean, all hail Erictho.
Mhm.
Yes, like bow at the foot of Paimon. Absolutely. Maybe not decapitate your daughter in the process. But like tongue pop all day long. Um,
Mhm.
this is for you, Alyssa Edwards. And uh, yeah, steal the fire from heaven. And put it in a salad. Um, yeah, there shit. Rub some shit on you and engage in the taboo so that you can get tricked by the trickster god, drink a bunch of wine, and apparently sleep with your sister, but come back in the form of a Spanish conqueror to decimate the native population. And maybe eat some fish seasoned with red pepper so that you can be turned into a dog and live a simple life by the hearth. Um, uh, Stick a needle in the blood bag you call your, jugular, and let it flow all over your favorite resin of choice, so that your dead can talk to you as you're dying. And maybe lick a pipe or two that's not made of lead, because we do value your sanity. And thank you, Denise and the Young Lords, for bringing in lead testing in New York City and across the country in response.
Mhm.
Um, uh, Seek the hermit coming down the mountain, not the hermit going up the mountain. Um,
Mm.
uh, Camels, look for that red ghost, and just get that skeleton off his back. He's had a rough few decades. Um, and still don't know if they're like camel humps or water or yellow bags of fat like boobs, but um, you know, um, you know, yeah. Sure. What? Oh, and holy babies, holy babies. May all of us be boy bishops, lady bishops, and otherwise, and turn the world on its head and create what we want to see, because that is the true thing we do as magicians, witches, carcists, all. Yeah.
Mm.
Did I get everything?
I think you got everything, yeah. May our
Oh,
endings be deliberate, and may our
damn the
deliber
dragon's tail! Damn it to hell!
and may our deliberations end uncertainties.
Wipe out a third of the stars from heaven. Star Wormwood has fallen. All right. Peace out, home skillets. And a lovely Childrenmas and a happy new year.
See you soon.
Don't threaten me.